A young man was walking leisurely down the street. Suddenly, chains appeared out of nowhere and entangled his legs. He fell, bumping himself painfully and dropping the briefcase he was carrying. When he recovered a little from the shock, he noticed the young witch. There could be no doubt that it was her. A pointed hat sat on her head. There were crows circling around. They called her the Raven Witch. That's who this fascinating story is about. A beautiful 2-story mansion with a small apothecary shop on the ground floor. It was run by Varna Spalding. To wake up, Varna decided to make herself a cup of flavored coffee. Didi, the white ferret, rushed to the scent. He stood on his hind legs as if asking for a treat. But since ferrets don't drink coffee, he was offered a lump of sugar. Didi gladly accepted the treat. A bell hung in front of the entrance to the pharmaceutical shop. The bell rang to signify the arrival of a new visitor. This time a woman came into the shop and asked for help. She said that her son's skin had suddenly turned purple. Wanda looked at her questioningly. The woman said he was attacked by a Raven Witch, and after that his skin color changed. Everyone in Blairock knew about the Raven Witch. Her targets were crooks of all sorts and ranks. She was feared by petty thieves, crooks, and corrupt authorities. She was even dubbed the Dark Heroine. Everyone she caught was cursed with the Raven Curse. In fact, it was because of this curse that the Dark Heroine of Blairock began to be called the Raven Witch. The woman cried. She did not understand why her son had fallen victim to the witch. He had a wedding the day after tomorrow, and he couldn't face the guests like that. Varna managed to calm the visitor down. She said she could prepare a potion that would help her in this situation in just one day. The important thing is not to tell anyone about the witch. Let it remain a secret. Varna promised that tomorrow at noon the woman could come for a cure for the curse. Varna picked up a quill and wanted to write a letter. But then she noticed Didi, who had opened a drawer and started climbing into it. Wanda didn't like that. Besides, she had told her repeatedly that climbing was forbidden. Didi walked over to the cellar hatch and froze beside it. Varna realized that he was demanding another treat, as if he knew where it was hidden. The animal looked so hopefully into his eyes that it was impossible to refuse him. But the shop could not be left unattended. So Varna put up a sign saying closed and locked the door. Opened the basement and went down into it. It was like a lab. Lots of books, some kind of test tubes. The place was carefully hidden. All because the Raven Witch's outfit was kept here. Too bad she didn't know she was getting married. Then she would have prepared a more interesting preparation. Varna began preparations to become a witch. Yes, the Raven Witch was Varna Spalding herself. Just an amazing combination. A witch and an apothecary. A man who bestows ailments and can heal. But as such, there is essentially no curse. Varna just makes everything so that the side effects look a lot like a curse. Varna couldn't help herself and gave Didi another treat. Then she changed the sign on the door. The bell rang again and another visitor entered the pharmacy. It was Officer Sion. Varna hadn't expected such a visitor. She immediately wondered why he was here. The officer handed her the bottle and asked her if she knew about this medication. Varna took it, looked at it carefully, and recognized it immediately. She thought to herself that it was just a bottle of potion, and the officer hadn't come to her to talk about the Raven Witch. Wanda also noted that she can't tell what's in that bubble, so she needs to check the composition. The officer asked if 5 minutes would be enough for her. Varna smiled and said that she had enough time. She was annoyed by the policeman and his manner of speech, but she did not let it show. It was as if he were conducting an examination. The officer said he was waiting 5 minutes. Varna withdrew. She wanted very much to understand why he had come to her. The officer noticed Didi's ferret. He was standing there, looking at him pitifully and obviously begging for a treat. Officer Zion fumbled through his pockets and found several slices of beef jerky. He held them out to the animal. Didi thought, since the man gives goodies, it's obviously a friend. Literally 4 minutes passed and Varna appeared, holding a vial of medicine. She analyzed it and said that the bottle contained tocopherolmine. However, the officer was not in the room. Where did he go? She noticed with horror that the door to the basement was open. Varna started down the steps, and was horrified to see the officer who was holding Didi. He said she's got a very interesting place hidden here, but maybe it's better to call her a Raven Witch. Varna realized she was in big trouble. Varna looked at Didi, who was eating slices of dried meat. She knew at once who had shown the officer the door to the cellar. Oh, what have you done? But goodies can't just appear in your mouth. Varna realized she needed to assess the situation first. She decided to pretend to be a Raven Witch fan. She just collects things, and now there's clearly been a misunderstanding. But the officer clearly didn't believe her. There were a lot of different bottles in the basement, and it didn't look like anything. At least there weren't any prohibited items. The policeman thought about it, and realized that all these bottles were to imitate the Raven's curse. Varna was confused. She didn't know how to get out of this situation and what to do next. Should she try to pretend to be a fool and tell the officer that it was all a dream? Or tie him up and lock him in here? Or maybe just give him some hyacinth? The officer noticed the look and hastened to assure Varna that she had nothing to worry about. He's not going to arrest her. Varna recalled that he had introduced himself as a law enforcement officer. Officer Sion said that yes, he was a law enforcement officer, but not the most exemplary one. What does he want then? Just yesterday, everyone wanted to catch her as a Raven witch. Should we believe him now? The officer said that if he wanted to detain her, he would have done so a long time ago. He pointed the gun at Varna as if to show that he would have apprehended her at once, but he did not do so. It must be said that she was frightened. He then began to ask her about the medicine he had given her. Varna said that tocopherol is a sleeping pill and is prescribed to those who suffer from insomnia. The officer said she was correct, but if he knew, why did he ask about the drug? The officer then turned around, said goodbye, and said he had an evening patrol waiting for him. Varna asked him to stop. The officer turned round and asked about her concerns about the denunciation. He said that if Varna was really a Raven witch, he could easily take care of the problem. Then he left. The next day, the apothecary shop was back in business. Varna was at her desk as usual, but she was very worried about yesterday's situation. Yes, everything seemed to be fine this time, but could she let it go? Although the situation with him in general was rather strange. Why did the officer just walk away? Anyone else would have been speechless or just really scared. He recognized her real identity and reacted so coldly. Then why do I need evening patrol? But then Varna thought that the whole situation was to her advantage. Thanks to the officer, she's not in trouble for being found out. We have to take the officer's word for it and get on with the job, and if he causes trouble, it will be her future self who will deal with it. The bell rang again, and yesterday's visitor entered the shop. She immediately asked if the medicine was ready for her son. Varna assured her that the medicine would help 100%, and her skin problem would definitely be resolved. The woman handed Varna an envelope and said it was an invitation to her son's wedding. Let her come if she has time. Wanda opened the invitation once more, looked at it. She wanted to attend the wedding, but secretly. She could attend openly, though, for she had the invitation now. The invitation said that the Crawfords and the Grossvans were getting married. There were many guests at the wedding. People made toasts and raised their glasses to the newlyweds. The groom, George Grossvan, raised his glass high. He wanted to thank everyone who had come to congratulate them. The union of the two families would bring prosperity to all. Varna looked at him carefully, noting that his skin had returned to normal and was a normal color. She remembered what he looked like then. He was on his knees, his hands tied behind his back, and his skin was an eerie shade of purple. He'd sworn he didn't know anything. But the Raven Witch didn't believe a word of it. He asked why he had rented a very expensive ship without even knowing what was inside. George said that he had been promised to be paid if he did everything as instructed. He just cried and said he only moved it and nothing more. Varna watched his actions carefully and realized he seemed to be telling the truth. She sipped her wine leisurely and thought how wise it was to use the Grossvans' ship to distribute goods. One only has to look at George to understand. The organizer must be someone who knows all the circumstances of this family well. Varna scrutinized the invitees. She realized that every guest here was simply wearing a mask of virtue. Varna's gaze came across one rather good-looking chap. He was holding a glass of wine like everyone else. Varna realized that she was seeing the officer from yesterday. She peered after him, not realizing what he had forgotten in this place. It was unlikely that he had appeared here as a policeman. When he'd visited the apothecary shop, he'd certainly introduced himself. If he was from a prominent family, she would know that for sure. As she stood thinking, an officer came up behind her. He said he had been waiting, for he was sure she was coming. Varna looked at him questioningly. He crossed his arms and confirmed his words about waiting for her. He still had a few questions regarding the Grosswen case. The officer said George was working on the family's ship and transporting goods he didn't know about. And then the Raven Witch appeared. The officer said he'd known what George was doing for a long time. Varna, on the other hand, was late to act. Wanda was surprised that the police had taken over the Grossvan's affairs. It was strange, for she had never noticed any police interference. Then she asked the officer, why was he turning a blind eye to what George was doing? The officer responded that he wanted to use it to get as much information as possible. But that plan was a mistake. Wanda then realized why the officer had turned up here. He must be undercover. However, that was not the case. The officer turned up at the wedding for his younger sister, May Crawford. It was May Crawford who was the bride. Varna didn't expect the culprit of the celebration to be the officer's sister. But the most interesting thing was that the officer was from the Crawford family. Varna remembered that when the officer had appeared in her shop, he had only given his name. He was Cyan Crawford, the second son from the family. The Crawford family was quite famous for getting rich in the hotel business, but Varna had no information about the second son of the Crawfords. For that reason, she couldn't recognize him by sight. But here's the amazing thing. Why does he serve in the police force if he has such a family business at his fingertips? Only the servants of the people aren't really servants of the people. Then she asked him, why is he alone? After all, today is a very important event for his family. The officer said he just wanted to be alone. Then Varna said she had to run. In her stomach, a real battle had broken out. The medicine Varna gave to George Grossvane's mother does more than just bring his skin color back to normal. The groom's exit was then announced. The door opened and the groom himself appeared. All the guests stared at him with their mouths open in amazement, and there was much to be astonished at. The bridegroom had tears in his eyes and horns on his head. He had turned into a goat. It was because Varna had mixed the medicine with a special potion that would turn his face into a goat's face for one day. Varna called it goat poison. Varna herself wanted to admire this beautiful performance, for she knew how long it would take for the potion to work. But she didn't want to see his sister's wedding upset in front of Officer Cyan's eyes. Varna was ashamed of what she had done. People realized that it was the warrior's curse. They sympathized with the unfortunate man, some offering to give him some herbs to chew. Officer Cyan saw all of this. He realized perfectly well who was to blame, so he hurried over to Varna. The officer marveled at what modern medicine can do. Understandably, people immediately associated what they saw with the curse, but Varna pretended not to know what he was talking about. Varna said his sister wasn't the target of this chaos. It just happened. To Varna's surprise, the officer said that this outcome pleased him. The fact was that George was an alcoholic, but Varna knew nothing about it. Cyan said that every night George spent money. He didn't know where it came from and ordered several girls at a time. Varna said that men like George shouldn't get married at all, so she played a joke on him to make him the laughingstock of the world. Just why didn't Cyan tell his sister about George's true identity? His words that his sister was aware of it struck her unpleasantly. Why did she want to marry him anyway? But Cyan didn't have an answer to that question. Perhaps feelings were to blame. The officer was very interested in the medicines that Varna was compounding. He was interested in those drugs whose effects people attributed to the curse. Varna said that her potions were really good. The officer asked her to show them to him. Varna didn't really want to make this excursion, but she had no choice. She invited the officer to follow her. He asked her what medicines she had hidden here. Varna replied that she had everything she wanted and even some curious specimens. Varna was very excited to be able to show her skills to someone. She didn't see the officer pick up one of the vials, but he held it back and it shattered with a clatter. Varna turned round at the sound, and she saw the officer begin to shrink in stature. She had no idea that this excursion would turn out this way. The officer himself did not realize what had happened. He looked at Varna and asked about it. Varna offered to tell more about the potion. It was a clever hallucinogen, capable of inducing hallucinations for a while. A person who tasted it would see flowers instead of human faces. That is why the drug was called Tsvetic Tadpole. The officer said it was a masterpiece of a name. Varna also praised it because he liked it very much. The officer looked at the shelves of vials and asked, "Are all the potions here like this?" Varna boasted that yes, they were skilled at cursing. Varna spotted Didi, who was sleeping peacefully on one of the shelves. Didi was sleeping very soundly and sniffling. Officer Cyan addressed Varna again and said she was very arrogant. He thought it was very dangerous to keep so many things. But Varna was of a different opinion. She realized that, which was why she had carefully hidden the potions in a secret place. The officer argued that the place was not too secret, since he had managed to find it. but the culprit was a peacefully sleeping Didi. It was an accident because nothing like this had ever happened before. The officer stated that from this day forward, all potions stored in this basement are confiscated to be disposed of. Varna really didn't like that statement. The officer was as serious as ever. Varna felt he had no right to dispose of her potions. The officer said that there was such a right, as they were not legal. Didi remembered well the person who gave him the goodies. He woke up. He jumped off the shelf. His tail hit one of the bottles. She fell. The jar split open and its contents spilled out. Some of the potion got on the officer's skin. He felt a burn. The officer was unlucky the second time, as he was once again hit with that height-reducing potion. The officer began to shrink before his eyes. Varna apologized to him. Since the previous clothes were clearly too big for the officer, Varna had to search the storerooms for something more suitable. She brought shorts, a jumper, and a small jacket. The officer looked more like a schoolboy than a law enforcement officer. The officer asked where the culprit of the whole mess, the ferret, had gone. After the incident, Wanda said a few affectionate words to Didi, who took offense and hid in a corner. The officer approached Didi and offered him slices of jerky. Didi was just happy at such a treat, and in gratitude he jumped on the officer's shoulders and wrapped his neck like a collar. Varna shouted at Didi, "Why doesn't he do that to her?" The officer thought she was just jealous, but in fact she was just jealous. She asked the officer, "Does his wound still hurt?" He said no and that it was fine. She gave him some cool remedy, which immediately began to work. It only took a few drops. Varna crossed her arms and said that her skill was worthy of the highest praise, but it wasn't a compliment at all. The officer asked why such a potion had to be made in the first place. Varna shouted that it had a special herb in it. Then she grabbed her head and said there was no antidote to it. The officer was upset by these words, for he could not remain small in stature forever. It was urgent to find an antidote to it. Varna replied that nothing would work. She had tried to make the antidote many times before, but nothing had worked. If she knew how to make it, the antidote would have been on her shelves long ago. The antidote was still in development. She promised that as soon as the antidote was ready, the officer would have it immediately. Varna said she would only need to analyze the herbs in the potion, so she didn't know when the antidote would be ready. She hastened to reassure the officer and told him not to worry, for Varna was the truest titan of thought. The officer asked for the potions to be disposed of, for he had already suffered from their effects. But Varna didn't like the idea. She considered her potions to be the cultural heritage of the nation, so she kept them so carefully hidden. But besides, some of her potions might be needed in the preparation of an antidote. The officer had no choice but to agree with her arguments. But he would definitely return to this conversation after the antidote was ready. The officer was very uneasy about his new appearance. He didn't understand how he was going to show himself in front of people. He thought for a few minutes and offered Varna to cooperate with him as a raven witch. After all, she was responsible for what had happened. The idea interested her, for surely the officer would want to teach someone a lesson. All he had to do was say one word and she'd be happy to teach him how to take the heat without getting his hands dirty. The officer then suggested that she start by being his mother. He was about to head off to school, and Varna was offered the role of his mother. But Varna didn't like the idea at all. She shouted that she was too young to have children. The officer said age should not be emphasized. Varna couldn't understand. If she had to portray herself, that is, the Raven Witch, why the officer was going to go to school. The officer recalled that the Grossvein family's ship was carrying some goods. He rummaged in the pockets of his cloak and pulled out a bottle with pink contents. Turns out the ship was used to transport medicine. When he first went to Varna's pharmacy, he ran a test. He needed to find a good pharmacist who could identify what was in the medicine. Varna asked to be given the bottle. She uncorked it and began to sniff it. She recognized the smell immediately. It was the smell of the sleep-wake medicine. The officer took the bottle again. He looked very upset because other pharmacists had told him the same thing. Varna wondered why they were giving a lot of money for this medicine and transporting it secretly on a ship. The officer also pointed out these oddities, that a simple medicine had taken them so far. The officer noted that there was another oddity in all of this. This medication was eventually delivered to the triplet school pantry. In Blarick, all children from elite families were bound to enter the triplet school. Varna began to ponder the situation. This whole thing was strange. Why the awakening medicine had to be hidden in the pantry? Maybe they wanted to give it to the children to help them learn better. The officer said he planned to visit the school and investigate. Varna realized his whole plan then. She would send him to school, pretending to be his guardian. The officer had a look that hardly anyone would have suspected him. The officer was sure that it was all very important. Varna was of a different opinion, otherwise he wouldn't have told her everything. Varna decided to mess with him a little. She reminded him who was who in this situation. She warned him that she could kill him if she wanted to, because he knew her most important secret. But the officer didn't seem to be in the mood for jokes. He'd told her before, if she wanted to get rid of him, he wouldn't interfere. And it wasn't a joke. Varna thought how he wasn't afraid of her. She looked at him aggressively, trying to instill fear in him, but the officer didn't seem at all afraid. He looked at her with some challenge. He realized perfectly well that if Varna had really wanted to kill him, she would have done it long ago. But she hadn't. She was probably just trying to intimidate him. Varna looked at him with some disappointment, for usually her techniques worked. The officer suggested not to waste any more time talking and to get down to business. But first we need to go to his house. Varna thought it was for the best. For now she could get a good look at the Crawford mansion. After taking a few steps, Varna decided to find out, and how would he explain everything to his family. But the officer said she didn't have to worry about that. He would take care of all the problems. They approached the mansion. Varna thought the house seemed quite ordinary for such a noble family. Zion knocked on the door, announced that he had come and demanded to be let in. Footsteps were heard, and the door was opened by a handsome, fair-haired young man. He looked questioningly at Zion's companion. Varna also stared at him in surprise. The man who opened the door for them stared at Zion and asked who it was. Why does he look like the real Zion as a child? He thought he was his cousin. Zion repeated that it was him. The young man thought he was just bullshitting. Varna decided to intervene in the conversation. She introduced herself. She asked who was before her. Aaron Banting. The young man wondered how she knew him, but Varna said that everyone in town knew him, because he was a popular person. Aaron Bunting was a local celebrity and popular actor. He had a big army of fans. Boys and girls were fans of him. Aaron put his arm round Zion's shoulders and asked him to tell him why he looked so strange. Varna stood silently watching the meeting. She thought that the boys would be able to figure it all out, and Zion would never give away her secret. However, Zion couldn't keep his mouth shut and told Aaron that it was a raven witch. Varna decided to turn it into a joke and laughed. She wondered whether she should drown Zion or just strangle him. There were already 2 of them who knew the raven witch's real name, and their increased number did not please Varna at all. She shouted at Zion. How could he just tell them like that? Zion hastened to assure her that Aaron was his friend, so there would be no problem. Varna continued to resent him. She asked how many other friends he had and whether he was going to tell everyone about her. Aaron asked about the witch's curse, so it was all fiction, and the so-called curse was the result of the potions. And Zion's new appearance was also due to them. He couldn't understand how such a thing could be done with potions, but Zion's appearance proved that it was possible. Aaron also wondered if the girl in front of him could prepare such potions and was a raven witch. Varna inquired about his condition. Didn't this information shock Aaron? Although, looking at his appearance, you'd think he was very afraid. However, such fear was well-founded. Varna is a witch who can cast curses. Anyone would be afraid. But the policeman was clearly an exception. He remained calm, knowing the truth. Aaron, recognizing that the raven witch herself was in front of him instead of being frightened, took her hands in his and was delighted by the event. It turns out that his close friend works in his theater, helped by a raven witch. She caught whoever stole from the guy. Aaron asked her to work tirelessly at all hours of the day and night. Varna is not only a raven witch, but she is also very modest, which also surprised him. Varna looked at Aaron and thought she had another fan. Aaron kept asking her questions. They say the witch had black hair, but Varna is blonde. Does she wear a wig? No, but it was all the effects of potions. Varna kept trying to figure out if Aaron was afraid of her or not. But he said he was a fan of hers too, so he wasn't afraid of her or the charms at all. Varna had thought that everyone was afraid of her, but that was not the case. The few people she had already met had expressed admiration rather than fear. Then she decided to find out where they had ended up after all. She thought it was Zion's house. However, this was not quite true. Zion did live in this house, but together with Aaron. He didn't want to get involved in his family's problems, so he preferred to live separately. The Crawford family was quite meticulous, so that's how it turned out. Cyan suggested getting to the point after all. He asked Aaron for help. Aaron didn't realize what help would be required of him, for no one had brought him up to speed yet. He also reminded Varna that she would have to fulfill the role of his mum. All participants had questions or grievances. Aaron didn't understand anything about his mum's role. Varna demanded that they learn to speak normally to avoid any misunderstandings. She also blurted out that she couldn't play the role, but Cyan was confident in her abilities. He didn't doubt her at all. Our heroes came to the school. The school children learnt that they had been visited by Aaron himself and ran to him. Many had only seen him on TV. Everyone was very eager to see the celebrity. The teacher apologized to Aaron for the children making noise. Aaron was used to the increased attention to his person, so the situation didn't make him nervous at all. He introduced Cyan as his cousin Thomas Benning, and Varna introduced as their Aunt Vanessa Banting. Varna smiled her sparkling smile and said that she was very happy to meet him. She is the one who became Thomas's mum. Aaron scrutinized the school environment. At one time, he had graduated from this school. It had not changed much since then. Varna didn't even know that Aaron himself went to this school. He said that Thomas was a bit weak in health, so he was very worried about him. But modern schools often have infirmaries. The teacher was just telling me that their school had recently opened a new infirmary. They spent a lot of time looking for a nurse, but it has proved very difficult to find a really suitable person, and those who do not have enough experience refuse the offer themselves. Then Aaron said that their aunt was actually a nurse. She even had to work temporarily at another school. Thomas confirmed that his mum is a very talented and accomplished person. The teacher shrieked in surprise. This was a real stroke of luck. Varna smiled and said that she really liked children, although she never really did such things. In fact, the triplet school was in need of a nurse, and it was obvious that the very same medicine had to pass through the hands of the school infirmary. Varna said that at her school they just let sick children go home. There was no infirmary. The officer said that the infirmary at triplet school was new. Rumor had it that they'd been unable to find a nurse for a long time, and it turns out they still don't have one. Of course, Cyan immediately thought that Varna should get a job there, only she didn't like the idea herself. She was worried that there would be no one to watch over her shop. But Aaron said she didn't have to worry about her shop. He'd take care of everything. He can sell simple medicines. Only Varna has to make them in advance. Aaron also surmised that if he himself were to become at the counter, the number of customers would multiply. Instead of rejoicing, Varna wondered if it would all do any harm. In the end, she agreed. She found it hard to believe that she would have to fulfill the role of a nurse. It turned out that the school, although prestigious, was actually quite poor. Cyan later reminded Varna that she had not wanted to play the role of a mother, but that in the end, she had just got into it. She had her own principles. Everything should always be done well. Aaron went down into the Raven Witch's underground and was surprised at what he saw there. He reached for the potion bottle to get a closer look, but was stopped by a menacing shout. Varna said that if he took it, he would turn into an anti-eater for a day. Aaron was scared. He didn't want to turn into that animal. And why would such a thing be kept in the shop in the first place? He noticed Diddy lying on the bedding with his paws up. Aaron thought he'd been turned, but Varna hurried to reassure him that it was just a ferret. The officer handed him a slice of beef jerky, and Diddy woke up immediately. He loved that treat so much. He was like crazy about them. Varna asked why the officer was carrying the treat. Aaron said that Cyan carried it with him on purpose, so that he could feed stray cats during his patrols. Varna remembered that when the officer had come to her shop, he had left pretty quickly for his evening patrol. Turns out it was all about the cats. Varna inquired about working as a police officer in that case. Cyan thought for a few seconds and said he would say he was sick. On the whole, that was true, but it would be up to Aaron to go to Sheriff Leon. Aaron didn't refuse his friend, but noted that he was now doing his job. Varna felt guilty after all. It was because of her and the potions that this whole situation had happened. She asked Cyan how his wound was. Overall, it was fine, but it would be better covered before going to school. Varna reached into her lockers and said she would do everything. She took Cyan's hand, scrutinizing the damage. It was small, so it would soon disappear on its own. Aaron asked Cyan which class he would go to. He turned round and looked at Aaron. He didn't understand why he was asking, because he didn't think it made much difference which class he was going to. But Aaron had a different point of view. He thought that every class had its own special atmosphere. But Cyan didn't go to school, so he didn't know all that. And it was true. Zion didn't attend school. A teacher came to his home and taught him that way. By the way, his brothers and sisters had similar training. Zion looked at his arm and where the wound had been, and was surprised to see that it had simply disappeared. There wasn't even a trace of it. Aaron walked up behind Zion and lifted him up. He laughed, for Zion would soon have a new school life. True, he wasn't happy about it, but he had nowhere to go. Zion hoped he could figure out why the drug was being given to the school. That would allow him to close the case. He believed that it didn't matter at all what class he got into, or whether he liked school. When Zion, who was now called Thomas, came to school, the boys just jumped all over him. Everyone wanted him to be in their class. He found himself at a crossroads. He had to choose one of the roads, but which one? The Raven Witch ran swiftly down the corridor. The policemen were preparing to shoot her. The Raven Witch had a long and strong chain with her. She gave it a swing and threw it onto the beam so that the chain wrapped tightly around it. She then did a cool somersault, allowing her to jump onto the roof. One of the policemen stood gaping and watching the Raven Witch, who stood on the roof. This time the Raven Witch put a curse in the form of a mushroom on his head. It wasn't so terrible because it could have been much worse. Sheriff Lean arrived on the scene. She was the beautiful girl Zion was just talking about. She was searching for the Raven Witch. Varna liked the fact that Zion, as a subordinate of the sheriff, pretended not to know. He must have been afraid of her because she could snitch on him if necessary. At Triplet School, there have been 2 classes since ancient times: owls and crows. Zion was asked to talk to the heads of both classes. They would explain everything to him, and he would decide which class he wanted to study in. Cian thought that these complications didn't make sense. You could just take any class you wanted. He met with the class heads. The headmaster of the pigeon class was called Tina Esto. She immediately decided to be friends with him because he was Aaron's nephew. Then the headman of the owls appeared and introduced himself as Ben Rofelt. The teacher invited the head teachers to give more details about the classes. Thomas has to listen carefully and choose the right one for him. The competition between the classes was fierce. The headmasters shot glances at each other, and then decided that Tina would start first. She said that Aaron had been in their class before, so he might not listen to the information, because he already knew everything. Nevertheless, she began her story. Tina said that her class offers a variety of extracurricular activities, allowing you to choose an activity of your choice. There is music, drawing, acting. There are a lot of kids in the class who have aptitude. There are those who constantly win different awards. Thomas objected that he had no such peculiarities, but Tina hastened to assure him that he needn't worry about it at all. No one would notice, and he could enjoy what he liked best. Ben, the head of the owl class, decided to intervene. He said that the world is not as beautiful as it seems, and the school's task is to prepare all students to face the cruel reality in which only the strongest survive. That's the way it's always been. Therefore, the best conditions can be found in the owl class. Here it is suggested to develop academic skills. Ben strongly recommended choosing the owl class to anyone concerned about their own future. Each headman wanted to see a new student in his class, so there was even a small altercation. The headmen were anxious to get an immediate answer. Zion stood and remembered saying that every class had a special atmosphere. Aaron was probably right about that. He stood there, not sure what to say. He didn't really care about the atmosphere, but he didn't want to interfere in this fight. As he pondered his answer, a student from the owl class came running into the room. He told Headmaster Ben that there was a problem. The bloke who burst in said that the matter was urgent and needed the headman to follow him. Meanwhile, Varna was in the infirmary. She took up her duties. She opened one of the cabinets where the medicine bottles were kept and started looking through the shelves. As she looked through them, she realized that the medicine she was looking for wasn't here. It didn't look anything like the drugs that were usually supplied to the infirmaries. She felt very tired, for she had run a lot during the night. She wondered if Aaron would be able to look after her shop. Suddenly there was heavy banging on the door. Someone shouted that the patient needed help. She invited me in. When the door opened, she saw the head teacher, Ben. The class teacher was leaning on him, but what a shape she was in. Ben said she had suddenly fainted. The class teacher, whose name was Feely, just started to say the words as blood spurted out of her mouth. Varna did not hesitate, immediately put her to bed and gave her medicine. The woman noted that she felt much better. Varna did a thorough examination of the woman and determined that she had asthma, and now the condition had developed complications. The medication she was taking was having a temporary effect. But Feely needed rest. Feely sat up, saying she was fine and she would definitely make it through this. But Varna saw that she was far from all right. It seemed as if she was just in the process of dying. Feely thought it wasn't that bad and she didn't need the time off, but she was still spitting up blood. Her condition was very bad, so Varna decided to talk to the director herself. Feely said Vanessa, Varna's alias, is very marvelous. Varna stood with a smile on her face. She said it wasn't that complicated, but Feely definitely needed peace. Vanessa went to the principal's office to explain the situation. Mia took it calmly and agreed that Feely needed a rest, except that she offered Varna a substitute class teacher. Varna didn't think she could take on that responsibility, but the headmistress was very persuasive. She said it was no big deal. But Varna already had a job at the nurse's station and what to do about it. Mia suggested that she should stay at the nurse's station during normal hours and check her attendance during school hours. The director assured me that everything would be fine, but if anything went wrong, all responsibility would be hers alone. Varna was beginning to doubt that she was in an elite school. How can an institution be run like this? The principal said that with this situation, Thomas would have to go to the pigeon class as he would not be able to be in the same class as his mum. Varna kept forgetting that she was playing the role of mum. She was not used to it. Varna thought the situation was getting more and more confusing, and now, because of her, Thomas would not be able to choose a class. But Thomas, Zion, hastened to reassure her, for all this was not Varna's fault. The principal watched them interact and kept marveling at what a great relationship they had. She offered Varna a pass and was about to introduce her to the classes. When Aaron found out that Zion had to go to the pigeon class, he laughed for a long time. In addition, Varna became the class teacher of the owl class. Aaron laughed until he was in tears. Varna recounted her meeting with headman Ben. He said Varna doesn't have to worry about anything. They can manage on their own as they know what to do and how to do it. All she has to do is note attendance for a month. They will take care of the rest. Varna thought it was some kind of rude class. The kids here didn't look like regular kids. Aaron said a teacher can't talk like that. He then asked Thomas what he thought of the pigeon class. Toth told me that the head teacher was just happy to see him in her class, but he was embarrassed by the number of questions that came from his classmates. They immediately started asking him what he liked best. He was even tired of such attention because he preferred quiet and solitude. His classmates thought Thomas was just showing them his acting game and he portrayed a calm student, but that was not the case. Zion confessed that this class was completely unsuitable for him. He would rather go to the owl class, but only because of Varna can't do it, though essentially Varna had nothing to do with it at all. Zion asked about the infirmary, and if it had those medicines, but Varna, being there, had scrutinized everything and didn't find them. She doubted that the medicine was from the infirmary. Zion asked her to keep an eye on the teachers, and he would keep an eye on the students. The main thing was to make sure there were no more new follies. Aaron appeared and told Zion that he had honored his request and told the chief that he would be absent. Aaron added that she'd said that Zion hadn't been much use, so if he was going to be absent, it wouldn't be a big deal. Was all he did at work was loaf around? Varna thought he was essentially abdicating his responsibilities. Zion didn't like the way Varna was looking at him. Maybe there was something she wanted to say to him but didn't dare. The lights were switched on in one of the rooms of the school. In a special machine there were test tubes with substances. Components were added to them one drop at a time. The school principal noticed the lights on and decided to ask what was going on. She opened the door and saw the young man who was working with the drugs. Why was he here since the workday was long over? It was Jerry's teacher. He said he was busy preparing for an experience he was going to show the students tomorrow, but the principal noticed that there was blood on his sleeve. Jerry explained that he had been with Sophia, the teacher, when she fainted. Apparently that's when he got his clothes dirty. The principal asked her not to scare her like that again, because she thought it was his blood. Jerry said he had important things to do, so he left the teacher in the care of the head teacher and left. The headmaster asked, did he know that there was a new student in the pigeon class? Jerry didn't know that and was slightly surprised. Varna was in her shop and was busy making orders. When everything was done, she decided to take on the bookkeeping. She looked at the paperwork and found that the revenue had indeed gone up. Varna noticed Zion, who was sitting there doing nothing. But he couldn't leave, for Aaron was fast asleep on the couch. He was sniffling like a baby, and Sion didn't want to wake him. Varna wondered why Aaron had settled here. Sion said he liked the atmosphere here. It was the same as in the cellar. Sion decided to find out what the status of his antidote was. Varna yawned and said she was in complete control of the situation. She is a true master in every field, taking on the role of teacher, raven witch, and sacrificing her own sleep to develop a cure. And now she's actively working on it. Aaron asked not to take too long to make the medicine, as he was extremely uncomfortable in this body. Varna replied that it was because of the occasion that he could investigate the school in peace. Sion asked, "Did Varna not decide to sideline the making of the antidote because of this?" Varna noted that there has been no change since Sion got younger. Sion asked, "So what?" Varna wanted to know how long the effects of this potion would last. Sion shouted that he wasn't ready to be a lab rat. But Varna had no such plans. Everything had come out spontaneously. Sion wanted to regain his normal appearance as soon as possible, so he demanded that the antidote be made as soon as possible, or he would turn her into the police. Varna agreed. Varna went to the students. Since it was her duty to monitor attendance, she entered the classroom and took roll call. All the students were present. Varna advised everyone to be attentive in class and then left. Playing teacher had worn her out. She headed for the infirmary, but then she was called out. It was Jerry Wyatt, the class teacher of the pigeon class. Varna, whom many called Vanessa, smiled and greeted him. He inquired, "She is replacing teacher Sophia, isn't she?" Varna confirmed that yes, as it happened. Jerry promised that he would look after her son. She didn't realize which son she was talking about at first, but she remembered that she was playing the role of Thomas's mother. Varna smiled sweetly and thanked him for his concern. She noted that Thomas is a rascal, but not to worry. Thomas was nearby and heard the whole conversation. He did not like being called a rascal. Varna decided to turn the whole thing into a joke. Thomas said hello to the teacher who had not greeted him yesterday. Varna stood there wondering how she could get out of here as quickly as possible. Luckily, she remembered that she needed to go to the infirmary. It turned out to be the perfect reason to get away from them. Before leaving, Varna told Thomas to obey his teacher and study diligently. Thomas replied that she could not worry about him at all and that she should not overdo it. Varna did not like this saying. She thought and why, and more importantly, for whom she was trying so hard to play the role of mum. Thomas told the teacher that he should be going to class already. There was a maths lesson. The class was working out the solution to a problem. Thomas sat there thinking how simple it was. And no wonder, for he was actually 23 years old. Suddenly, he felt his left arm ache. It hurt where the burn had been. The pain was hellish. Thomas felt as if his hand had been taken and shoved into the fire. He felt very sick. In addition, he began to feel dizzy. The head of the class noticed his condition. He asked her to take him to the infirmary. But there was no time to fulfill his request. Thomas fainted. Thomas was taken to the infirmary, where fortunately Varna was. He was immediately put on a bed. Wanda questioned him carefully about what had happened. She wasn't quite sure what was going on because everything had been fine before. Varna said she would look after Thomas herself, even though the head of the class was against it. But she's his mum, so she's the only one who can look after him. The headman decided to leave them as he had a lot of things to do. As soon as he left, Varna set to work. She decided to look at the hidden burn. Looking at the sore spot, Varna noticed that the wound was swollen. Varna didn't know what to do or how to be. Perhaps it was an adverse reaction from her potion. As she pondered, Thomas came to his senses. His head and arm ached. He decided to look at the wound and noticed it started to look different. Varna then first apologized and then expressed her request. She wanted Thomas to take off his clothes. She demanded that it be done as soon as possible, which Thomas certainly didn't like. Wanda also gave him a vial of potion. After he undresses, he must drink it. While he's doing that, she'll be out. Varna stepped out and waited for a reaction. She had her own ideas about it. She didn't have to wait long, though. Soon she heard Thomas's voice. He demanded that she come in as soon as possible and give her an explanation. When she entered, she noticed Thomas sitting on the bed. He was back to the way he had been before. That was the effect Varna had hoped for. That was why she demanded that he take off his clothes. If he hadn't, the clothes would have come apart at the seams. Just what would he wear? Varna suggested dressing in a dressing gown and slippers for now, and then she would think of something. Varna stood and scrutinized Thomas, who had regained his former appearance. But he had to change his clothes, and it wasn't nice to have someone staring at you. When he came out, Varna's first question was how his palm felt. Did he still feel pain? He said no and wondered what she had given him. Varna replied that he had taken a simple anesthetic, but then why had his growth returned? Varna explained that the potion that made him young had some anesthetic in it, so she thought, what if she gave him that same ingredient? And she was right. Except it turns out the potion has a temporary effect. She didn't actually say it had side effects. Varna replied that this is not yet finalized. She is still in the process of developing an antidote. Of course, Thomas didn't want to become a child again. He reminded her that he wanted to get rid of the cellar. Varna was afraid of that, because the cellar was where she had all her work. She began to ask him to leave quickly. If they saw Thomas all grown up, he'd be in big trouble. But where could he go in just his dressing gown? Of course, he couldn't stay in the infirmary either. While they were thinking about what to do next, there was a knock on the door. It was Jerry White. What should they do? Varna advised him to hide quickly first before he came in. Thomas only had a few seconds. When Jerry came in, the first thing he did was ask how Thomas was feeling. Varna said she had sent him home, though that was not true. Thomas was in the other room, listening to the conversation. Suddenly, he remembered that his uniform had been left on the bunk. No one had ever put it away. Jerry heard some kind of sound. He immediately asked what it was, if there was someone inside. Varna immediately blushed. And that was Thomas. He tried to put away his school uniform, but accidentally stubbed his toe. Jerry went to the sound and saw a grown-up Thomas. He stared at him and asked, "Is that Thomas?" He stared at him and asked, "Is that Thomas?" But Thomas thought of a way out of the unpleasant situation. He said he had been mistaken for his son. Varna thought it was a bad idea to call herself Thomas's father, but they were two peas in a pod, so it worked. The important thing is that Jerry took it as the truth. He said that they looked very much alike, and when Thomas grew up, he would be like his father. Thomas confirmed that they really do look a lot alike. Everyone who sees them together is always surprised. He turned to Varna to confirm his words. At first she thought Thomas had just lost his mind, but then she realized if he was her husband, that's how he should be treated. Varna confirmed that she too had often heard about their uncanny resemblance. Jerry inquired about the purpose of the visit. Thomas replied that he had heard that his son was sick and had come to pick him up. But Thomas was wearing slippers. He explained that he hadn't even thought about his appearance because he was so worried. Varna decided to end the meeting quickly. She told him to go to the car because Thomas was waiting for him there. He said goodbye to Jerry's teacher and left. Thomas was walking and thought he had got off easy. He was carrying his school uniform in his hands. It was true that calling Varna expensive was definitely overdoing it. There was no one in the corridor of the school. Classes were in full swing. Thomas thought he was saved. He went to the nearest shop to buy some clothes. The shop assistant looked at him apprehensively, because he was still in his hospital gown and slippers. But in the end, she found him a nice outfit. Thomas came to Aaron and told him all about it. When Aaron heard the whole story, he laughed hard. How could anyone believe that a father had come to pick up his son at school in his dressing gown? Aaron turned to Varna and said that they were now playing the roles of spouses. Cyan kept trying to figure out why his body was suddenly back again. The wound on his arm appeared 4 days ago. Eventually, Varna thought that so much time equaled a cycle, but she wasn't sure of that, just guessing. Aaron asked, "Is Cyan coming out to be a child for 4 days again?" Cyan thought he might just not drink the painkiller so the transformation wouldn't happen. But Varna reminded him that it wasn't a good idea because that time he had fainted from the pain. Cyan thought it would be interesting for Varna to see the different scenarios. Maybe it would help her create an antidote. Aaron wondered how long it would take for Cyan to reprimand Miss Varna. They were now playing the role of husband and wife, and such treatment looked very unnatural. It would be better if he called her darling. Varna said that Aaron should have thought about who would listen to that nickname. Cyan felt a throbbing pain in his arm. Would there be another transformation again? The pain was exactly the same as it had been recently. Cyan noted that the process was happening too fast. In fact, not even half a day had passed. Cyan resolved to be patient. 2 hours had passed since then. Cyan kept enduring the pain. He was obviously not feeling well. Varna and Aaron were worried about him, asking how he was feeling. Cyan assured them that he was able to bear it for the time being, but they could see that he was in a lot of pain. They insisted that Cyan stop being stubborn and take some painkillers. A little more time passed and the pain let go. Cyan was glad he had been able to endure it, but he noticed how worried Aaron and Varna were looking at him. Why are they staring at him like that? He looked at his hand and realized what the reason was. He had become a child again. He was extremely upset that it hadn't worked out. Varna realized that the anesthetic had been the catalyst. Aaron regretted that Cyan had only agonized in vain, and it had all turned out to be in vain. Meanwhile, in the corridor of the school, Jerry's teacher and Tina, the head teacher, were talking. She was very worried about Thomas. Her teacher reassured her that everything would be fine. That's what his mom had said, so there was nothing to worry about. Tina said they finally picked a play to produce. They're going to put the prince and the witch. They already know who's going to play the witch, but they couldn't decide on a prince. But now they have someone who is perfect for the role. It was a new day. Tina and Thomas went to school. Tina Esto met them on the street. She was very happy that Thomas was feeling better and immediately asked about his condition. Tina was happy to say that they were going to put on a play and rehearsals were already planned for today. When Thomas and Varna heard the name of the play, they froze. Why a witch? Tina explained that the princess stories were boring, but this was something new. Tina bragged that she's also writing a screenplay. Thomas assumed that Tina was suggesting that he come and watch the rehearsal. But no, she offered him the role of prince. Thomas had not expected such a thing because it was the lead role. But he said he couldn't. He didn't want to be in the play. However, Tina almost tearfully began to ask for it. She felt that this role was just made for him. She asked what Varna thought about it. Varna looked at Thomas and said, "Why not? Let him try to play the part." The head of the owl class overheard the conversation. He said that exams were coming up and the pigeon class was doing all sorts of nonsense instead of preparing for them. Tina, the head of the pigeon class, didn't like it. She didn't think such classes were childish. Ben pointed out that he had already taken first place and was going to hang on to it. Varna didn't know that. Ben bragged that he has always tried to keep the bar high since entering the school, and he is the first for the 3rd year in a row. Tina pointed out that things are different in the pigeon class. Ben replied that it was, because all the students in that class did was walk and play. Tina countered that this is not true. On the contrary, this class tries to bring out the students' abilities. Varna decided to reconcile them. Really, no more fighting. Thomas offered to leave them and go. Varna kept asking him if he wasn't interested in the play. She wondered who would play the witch and how. Thomas realized that Varna was worried. She tried to assure him otherwise because it was a common interest, but Thomas thought that Varna was just not sure of herself, and that was why she was worried. Varna entered the classroom, took roll call. Everyone was in place. She announced that everyone would have independent study this morning. She also said that they should not talk but concentrate on their studies. She was pleasantly surprised at how they could study so independently with diligence. Varna wondered if she herself were from the nobility. Would she really be so diligent about her studies? Of that she doubted. Varna came to Ben and asked, "Does their class do something for the festival? For example, the pigeon class puts on a play, do they?" He replied that their class was preparing a special lecture for the top 10 students. Varna thought that studying was rather boring. Maybe they should try something more interesting. However, as she looked at the students bent over their textbooks, she realized that they were not interested in anything else. As she was about to leave the classroom, she heard a question. One of the students asked, "If she is not a real teacher, why does she interfere? And since she's doing roll call, it doesn't mean she's become someone important." Varna walked over to the one who was asking such questions. The young man really didn't like the look on her face as she looked at him. But she didn't yell back. She smiled sweetly and asked who was in front of her. Dean Abrams? She remembered the principal's words that there was one student in the owl class that she had to be very careful with. It was Dean Abrams. He was the son of William Abrams, the mayor of the town. He regularly requested reports from various city agencies, asked Sheriff Ryan how the neighborhood was doing. She reported that good results had been obtained. Crime rates in poor neighborhoods are down, and it was all due to the mayor increasing the budget, for which the sheriff was very grateful. The mayor thought otherwise. It was all thanks to the Raven Witch, who had surpassed him in popularity. The mayor suggested that the sheriff find the Raven Witch and offer her cooperation. But the sheriff didn't like that suggestion. Ryan felt that such vigilantes were dangerous. The Raven Witch was a hero now, but she could use her power for her own personal gain. The mayor stopped the sheriff's train of thought, for he realized it himself, but it looked like he'd left something unsaid. The sheriff inquired as to the reasoning behind the idea, and the mayor had them. His son Dean was becoming more disobedient by the day. The sheriff thought he didn't look like him at all. He thought Dean was a real kid, even though Luca was only 2 years apart. Luca replied that he shouldn't worry too much. It was just a normal teenage rebellion that would soon pass. The mayor would very much like it to be so, but there was a certain doubt in his soul. William Abrams was a fine mayor. He had the courage to kick out corrupt power brokers with family connections. When hiring, he considered qualifications above all else and was against discrimination. He succeeded well because of his leadership skills. He was simply a role model for the people of the city in all spheres. Varna couldn't understand how such a man could have a son like Dean. Varna stood beside Dean and thought about how hard it was to raise children and how to deal with this guy. In the end, Varna decided to play a little act. She clapped her hands together and said that Dean was right. She really wasn't a teacher, but an arrogant fake. Then she said that she should disappear, for she was more like a migratory bird. And in her absence, everyone should continue to study with pleasure. Then she simply walked out of the classroom, slamming the door. The students pulled their heads away from their books and notebooks and stared at the door. Varna walked and thought, if such a nice family couldn't handle him, she couldn't do it. And she shouldn't stand out, even though she had to play the role of teacher. Varna stretched and thought, it's great weather outside, maybe we should go for a walk. Meanwhile, Tina, the head of the pigeon class, went to the theater classroom to determine if they had enough props for the play. She liked what she saw. Surely everything they needed could be found here. The only thing missing was the trees, but they were big and probably in storage. She wondered if anyone could go there. When Thomas heard about the warehouse, he remembered being there a week ago. He looked around carefully but didn't find the drug he was looking for. It was probably very well hidden. Suddenly, he noticed shards of glass on the floor. He compared the shards he found with the vial and realized they were clearly from him. The perpetrators must not be very experienced to have left such a distinctive mark. Thomas told Tina that he was ready to go to the warehouse. Tina was very grateful for this and immediately asked, would Thomas agree to play the part of the prince after all? But no, he still didn't want to. Tina asked for a clue as to where the warehouse was located, but Thomas knew his location perfectly well. He walked across the school grounds and bumped into Varna. She thought Thomas was just skipping class. He asked, why is she here and not in her medical office? Varna smiled and said the weather was nice and she decided to go for a walk. She also asked where he was going. Thomas replied that he was going to the warehouse. Varna followed him. The warehouse door was open, much to their surprise. Turns out the warehouse was always open, both during normal times and during investigations. Varna immediately asked Thomas if he had noticed any changes, because he had been here before. Thomas looked around carefully, but he didn't notice anything had changed. Everything was the same as before. Varna spotted the staging trees. They were leaning against the wall. Since there were 2 trees, Varna suggested that they each take one. But Thomas decided that he could easily do it himself and didn't need any help. Thomas took another good look around and thought that something was wrong. I should look in the warehouse more often. When they were about to leave, they noticed that the door was closed. They'd left it open. Maybe there's someone else in here. There was some strange sound coming from outside, but they couldn't tell what it was. It was the sound of the chains. They were used to block the exit from the warehouse, but neither Varna nor Thomas knew about it. Varna went to the doors and tried to open them, but no such luck. Thomas immediately realized what was the matter and what sound they had heard. The doors were locked from the outside with a chain. They probably didn't know anyone was inside, so they locked them. But Varna said it was done on purpose, but neither of them knew who it was. Probably someone at school who disliked Varna herself. But she replied that it couldn't be, because she was a good girl. Varna surmised that they wouldn't be sitting here forever. Surely his classmates would notice Thomas's absence and ask why he hadn't returned, and they would definitely start looking for him. Thomas was very pensive. He was immersed in his memories. Varna wondered what was wrong. Maybe he got sick, or maybe it was just another side effect. But he waved it off and said it was fine. Varna grabbed him and shook him. She didn't understand why Thomas pretended everything was fine. But in fact, he wasn't, as his appearance told her. Maybe he forgot she's a pharmacist. Then she told him to sit down on the mattress. He should wait and not argue with her. Varna was very angry about the situation. She didn't know who had locked them up, but if she could find the culprits, she would gladly turn them into antiators. She looked at Thomas. He was unlike himself. Normally, he would have started to mock her, but now he sat there looking downcast. He must be really sick. Meanwhile, Dean and another boy met in the school corridor. They were the ones responsible for the situation. Dean decided to calm his mate down because you can always say that it's just a joke. And in general, because of the exams, he was just dying of stress. And at the same time, someone was walking around freely. But his school friend didn't quite understand what his stress had to do with the situation. Dean thought back to Varna. He really didn't like her face, her clothes. Dean's mate didn't like the situation, but Dean thought the nurse should be in her office. Dean stood with his back to the door and didn't notice Jerry enter the office. He knew at once that these two had done something wrong. Their looks spoke for themselves. It had been a while since Thomas had left, and Tina was beginning to worry about why it was taking so long for him to return. The other guys in the pigeon class thought that Tina was assigning Thomas something else, but she wasn't. She only asked him to bring trees for the play. Tina got so caught up that she forgot about the rehearsal altogether. Tina said she would go and check on the situation. Varna looked at the locked doors and wondered, how could it be? Had the kids in the circle forgotten about Thomas? Thomas was so exhausted that he laid his head on Varna's arm and fell asleep. Varna remembered how Thomas had passed out from the drug and how worried she had been about him. Varna sat there thinking, Thomas's condition wasn't good. I wonder what other side effects there are. She looked at Thomas asleep and thought, how amazing it was that a policeman was sleeping next to her. How could it be? There was a knock on the warehouse door. It was Jerry's teacher. He knocked and asked if Miss Vanessa was there. Varna heard that voice. She was so glad to hear Mr. Jerry. She immediately shouted that yes, she was inside. She wanted to wake Thomas. However, while she was distracted, Thomas disappeared. Where could he have gone? Mr. Jerry asked me to wait a little while. He'll open the door soon. Varna finally found Thomas. He was facing the wall. But Varna couldn't figure out what he was doing there, and he just stood there thinking about how he could fall asleep on her shoulder. He really wanted to just fall asleep on the spot. Varna thought he was feeling sick again. That's why he was acting like that. However, he assured her that everything was fine. He needed time to think about the investigation. Finally, the doors swung open. Jerry's teacher came running in. The first thing he asked Vanessa was if she was all right. She was pleased with the savior. The teacher was surprised that Thomas was also here. Varna asked the teacher, how did he know they were here? Jerry's teacher scratched his head and said that one of the students had admitted to seeing her enter the warehouse. So I decided to play a trick on her by locking the door from the outside. Varna didn't find the idea amusing. She immediately asked who the daredevils were who had decided to do the deed. She wanted to show them what a real prank should look like. Varna felt it was her turn to demonstrate her own strength. She wanted to put a curse of continuous mosquito squeaks on the jokers before they went to bed. Thomas saw the look on her face and realized that Varna was up to something. Tina appeared in the barn. She saw Thomas and immediately asked what had happened. When Varna returned to school, she immediately went to the principal's office to deal with the situation. She thought the prank had gone too far. After all, they had been locked up for more than an hour, not just a minute. The principal stood there and only spread her hands. She offered to settle the matter amicably, but that wasn't enough for Varna. She demanded that the bullies come and apologize in person. She didn't understand why the school principal was apologizing for them. Varna talked about how scared Thomas was. Thomas looked at her and thought that Varna was acting like a real mum. He was embarrassed to hear all this. He remembered sitting leaning against her shoulder. Dean was asked by a mate who was involved in this prank what would happen to them next. Dean smugly declared that there was no need to worry, since the school was on their side, so everything would be fine. This conversation was overheard by Thomas. He realized who was the generator of the whole idea. The boys were very worried. What if Mr. Jerry had found out something? Why did he go there in the first place? Dean thought that the teacher didn't know anything and was just passing by. These words particularly interested Thomas. What kind of place did they mean? The boys are getting ready to leave. One of them has to go to the classroom. The other has to make a good check to see if the locker is securely locked. Thomas decided to follow them to find out. The place one of the students went to was very much like a caretaker's closet. The young man opened the locker. On the field were the very same medicines. He looked around, made sure no one was around, and closed the door. He did not notice Thomas, for he was round the corner and thought it was all very strange, and the schoolboys were behaving suspiciously. The bell at the entrance to the apothecary shop rang again. Dee Dee heard this ringing and immediately jumped up. The door opened and Thomas walked in. He didn't have time to say a word because Didi was kissing him. Varna and Thomas entered the shop. Aaron met them at the counter. He immediately asked how their day was going and if there was any news. Thomas said there is news and a lot of it, so much that he just doesn't know where to start. Varna looked round the shelves of the shop and wondered how things were going. Aaron was a little embarrassed. He didn't know how to say everything. Varna was scared out of her wits. Aaron said that some rumors started to circulate that he was dating a local pharmacist. People had seen him behind the counter of the pharmacy and wondered why he was working here. They did not believe that he was just helping. Varna thought that was kind of absurd. Varna was stressed that because of Aaron there were too many visitors, and because of that, ridiculous rumors started to appear. When Varna thought about it, her head began to spin. What to do? Isn't this a real problem? Aaron began to reassure her. The gossip would stop soon, people would talk and forget. He was used to having gossip around him all the time. Varna drank a glass of water and thought how exhausting it was to be a celebrity. Aaron continued that even if they did meet. Varna drew back all the water she had just drunk at those words. Drops of water hit Aaron's face. Thomas thought the whole thing was silly. Aaron added that it's probably not such a stupid idea either. After all, they are each other's fans. Varna couldn't help herself. She didn't like this kind of game, and with all her might she punched Aaron in the jaw. He even flew off. Varna simply miscalculated her own strength and apologized. The whole honest company was sitting and having a peaceful breakfast. They were discussing the situation. Thomas was working in the kitchen and answering questions about the medicines he had found. He noted that there were quite a few in the cupboard. Aaron figured the kids had found this pile of drugs on their own somewhere, but Thomas said it was unlikely that was the case. It was more likely that someone had given them the drugs. Varna was sure that this medicine was a weak energizer. Its effect is commensurate with a cup of coffee. And even though there is a lot of medicine, it is probably not a particular problem. Thomas stood at the cooker and cooked. He thought the problem was that Dean Abrams had the drug. Aaron remembered that Abrams was the last name of the town's mayor. Could this Dean have something to do with him? Aaron didn't know that the mayor's son was named Dean. It was an unexpected turn for him. Thomas continued his story. He said that with Varna, he had to stay locked up in the warehouse for about an hour. Aaron didn't know anything about it. He began to ask Thomas if he was all right, if nothing had happened. Thomas assured him that everything was fine and not to worry. Varna looked at them in surprise. Aaron was so worried about Thomas. She thought that Thomas had already had to endure a situation where he had been locked up in the past, which was why Aaron was so concerned about him. Varna continued. She said the teacher found them quickly, and the students said it was just a prank. Thomas added that one of those pranksters was Dean Abrams. Varna noted that the school is asking them to forgive and turn a blind eye to the prank. The director tearfully requested it. If there is a fuss about this situation, she could easily lose her job. Thomas said he now tries to keep a low profile at school so the perpetrator doesn't suspect anything. Aaron asked if, when the investigation was over, he could come to the school and teach Dean Abrams a lesson. Thomas said that no, he could not do that. The food was finally ready and everyone was invited to the table. Varna remarked that the food looked very tasty. Thomas Sion clearly has a talent for cooking. Thomas noted that this is not the first time he cooks this dish and experiments all the time, but the result is the same every time. Varna noted that even though Thomas lives alone, he still cooks. He explained that he had to learn how to do this because he started living on his own. During the meal, Varna said that their conversation had turned to a completely different topic: food. She thanked Thomas sincerely for his efforts and said that the meal was delicious. Aaron noticed that the nature of the relationship had changed between Varna and Thomas. When Thomas returned to school, the first thing that greeted him was Tina. She immediately asked him about the role of the prince, hoping that Thomas would agree. And he hoped Tina had already forgotten about his idea. But no such luck. She couldn't understand how she could turn down such an interesting role. That's why she kept pestering him with questions. In the corridor, they spotted Jerry's teacher. He was obviously on his way to his lab, but Thomas hadn't heard anything about her. He was surprised enough when Tina told him about her. She explained that the lab was where the science lessons were held. It's strange that the teacher's been going there too much, especially lately. Not only that, whenever the teacher went there, he had a rather strange expression on his face. Thomas remembered the words spoken yesterday by the guys who had shut them down in the warehouse. They'd just then mentioned Jerry's teacher and worried that he'd sniffed something out. Thomas asked Tina how well she knew Mr. Jerry. He explained his interest by saying that he would like to know more about him as a person. Tina said that he had addressed the address. She knows one huge secret about Jerry's teacher that no one else knows about. Could it have something to do with their case? Thomas told Varna about everything. She was surprised that he was suspicious of Jerry's teacher, as she thought he was just a good teacher. However, Thomas replied that he was also good at chemistry. But it was wrong to suspect someone just because of their speciality. Thomas also said that Mr. Jerry had some big secret. That's what Tina told him, but she didn't say what it was. However, Tina has promised to reveal it after the festival is over. Varna wondered why only after he was finished, but then it came to her. Thomas promised that he would play the part of the prince, and in return, Tina would tell him about the teacher's big secret. Varna wanted to go to Aaron and tell him about it, but Thomas wouldn't let her. Soon it became known that the exam results had been published. Everyone was eagerly waiting for them, and as soon as the results were posted, the students went straight to look at them. Ben was sure he would take first place again, but there was another student in first place. This time the first place winner was Dean Abrams. Thomas was surprised by this. Varna noted that he had never previously managed to rise above 10th place. When Ben, the head of the class, saw the results, he nearly had a heart attack. Thomas reminded me, Varna said that the drug works like coffee, but if you drank a lot of it, could your grades suddenly jump up like that? Varna noted that this is simply not possible, only if it is taken daily. Thomas told her a story. Larry always managed to take first place in track and field. Thomas's own best result was 3rd place. But lately, in practice games, he keeps coming in first place. In a normal situation, he would have thought it was due to daily training, but not in this situation, as training takes a lot of time. A patient came to Varna with a nosebleed. She was alarmed by this fact. She asked if this was a common occurrence. Thomas said no, he just had a little runny nose, and he was fine now, so there was no need to worry. Varna had had an overly busy day. There were many patients, all of whom needed attention. Varna remembered that she had had too many sick children in the last few days. Some of them had been coughing for a long time. Others had tearing eyes. The symptoms were different, so it hardly seemed like an epidemic. However, Varna thought, what if these are side effects of the drug? A medicine can affect weak points in a person's body. Some medicines have these side effects. Thomas thought it looked like the medicine had been distributed to children. Varna was very worried about all this. She said she would ask Dean some questions, but Thomas didn't approve of the idea. Why ask him questions if he wouldn't answer? Besides, if he got first place because of the drug. But Varna wasn't the type to back down easily from a plan. She said she would take the risk anyway. Dean's nose was bleeding like the others. He tried to stop it, but it didn't help. Varna spotted him when he was near the lockers and called out to him. She invited him to come into her office. Dean wondered what she was doing here. Varna decided to tell the truth. She had been told that one of those lockers was full of psychostimulants, and she decided to check it out. Besides, he got first place in the exam. Dean shouted that psychostimulants could be bought anywhere, and not everyone would be the first to take the drug. She tried to calm him down and said she just wanted to congratulate him on first place. Then she smiled and added that being number 1 on stimulant alone is hard, and he knows that very well. Dean stared at her wide-eyed. Varna said that the medicine must have been mixed with some other drug, and she asked him if that was true or not. Varna had hit the mark. Dean's appearance said it all. He stood with his eyes downcast. But then he came to his senses and asked what she was going to do with this information. If she told about it, she would be fired and the school would be on his side. But Varna didn't care about being fired. She wasn't a real teacher. Dean naively thought Varna would be afraid, but it turned out not to be so. Who is this woman? What kind of person is she if she's not afraid of him? And it was incredible, as Dean Abrams was feared even by adults. But only this teacher is not afraid of him at all, then or now. But why? Dean looked at her with defiance in his gaze. Did she really think he, Dean Abrams, was afraid? Varna didn't think so. She stood and looked at him completely calmly. Evening came. Thomas noticed Jerry's teacher in the lab again. He stood looking at the vials of purple-colored preparations. Thomas didn't realize what experiments could be prepared at this late hour. He stared in amazement and didn't understand how it had happened. Vanessa invited Jerry's teacher and the headmaster for a serious talk. She said she learned a very interesting story from one of the students. She recounted the conversation with Dean Abrams. Dean tried to scare her with his powerful father. Varna then stated that she was not afraid of the mayor at all, plus she was clearly stronger than him. Dean didn't understand how some ordinary teacher could be stronger than the mayor himself. Varna explained that she thought she was stronger not physically, but chemically. Dean thought she was just messing with him. Then Varna took a vial out of her pocket and said that there are many different poisons in the world, and not every substance has color and smell. What if she used a drug like that? In doing so, it will look as if the student himself died from the drug he was taking. And everyone would believe her, for she was a real expert in the matter. Dean was scared out of his wits. He shouted, "Who is she?" Varna laughed sweetly and said it was just a joke. The vial she was holding was just water. But then she got all serious. She wanted to show how scary drugs could be, and if Dean kept acting like this, a lot of other guys would suffer from the side effects of the substance. She demanded that he tell her what drug he was taking. Varna showed Jerry's teacher and the principal a bottle of the substance. It was a common stimulant that you can buy. The school principal knew about the drug and that students often took it during exams. Varna continued and said, it had come to her attention that the students had recently started taking the drug in an unusual way. The principal and teacher stared at her as they didn't understand what she meant. Varna said a pellet is added to the drug and demonstrated it. This pellet contained the substance piatine. If it was mixed with a stimulant, the pellet would dissolve and the additional substance would become invisible to the human eye. The students called this preparation a revitalizing potion. It was the first time the principal and teacher of Jerry had heard the name. Varna explained that after taking this potion, there is some internal force that shakes things up. And Thomas added that the one who introduced the students to this potion was now in this room, and he pointed his finger at the principal. Thomas said he initially suspected Jerry's teacher, and there were grounds for this. The students said that the teacher was conducting experiments at night. He decided to find out more about them and followed the teacher. But as soon as the teacher left his lab, the principal walked in. She began to scrutinize the equipment there. The teacher looked at the principal and asked if it was true. The teacher looked at the principal and asked if it was true. Thomas continued. He said that the main process for making this potion was mixing. That's why he thought Jerry's teacher was involved. But just the experiments he'd done made him hesitate. The teacher said that he was preparing a common experience for the festival. He had to rack his brains for a few days, though, because nothing came out. Thomas said that yes, that was the case. The experiment the teacher was working on had nothing to do with the revitalizing potion. But when the director walked into the lab, everything fell into place. Varna said there was no point in denying it. Everything is already known as it is. But she asked the director to be honest. The principal cried and screamed. She didn't know it could turn out like this. She reported that a man came to the school about a month ago. He said that he was ready to provide a sample of a drug developed specifically for students at the school. It was being developed in the school's own research center. The drug improved physical endurance and memory. The director had to add pellets to a product already on the market. There seemed to be no danger. But before giving it to the children, she consulted Miss Sophia. It was likely that this conversation was overheard by Dean, as he asked to try the potion once. School children started using it. The effect of taking the remedy began to gradually manifest itself. The director admitted that she did not have any particular expectations about the drug, but when she realized the amazing result of taking just one pill, she began to imagine how the school children would be able to win all the awards. Children from high-ranking families would definitely come to the school to study. But it all went wrong. The children started to get sick. Although the man who provided the medicine said that there would be no side effects from taking it. All this made the director worried. She decided to find a research center herself. But there was no research center at the address given. Varna was glad that the headmistress had found the strength to confess everything. If she had kept silent, she would have had to use the power of the Raven Witch, and Varna didn't want that. After all, it would have complicated the situation even more. Varna thought about the situation for a long time. She came to the conclusion that the principal was not protecting Dean because he was the mayor's son. Thomas was in solidarity with this. The reason had to do with the drug itself. It was good that the situation was beginning to clear up, although there was no satisfying result yet. The director said that the building where the research center was supposed to be located did indeed look like one from the outside, but the inside was empty. Varna remembered the man who sold the drug. Perhaps the director remembers what he looks like or noticed some unique characteristics. The director said he was being very brazen and said he was doing what he was paid to do. Thomas thought the man was a crook too. How could the director have fallen for such an obvious deception? But Varna noticed that they were also doing the same thing, leading people astray by pretending to be a false mother and a false son. The principal should be punished. If what happened gets out of the school, it'll be known to the whole world. Varna said the main problem now is with students who are experiencing side effects from the drug. Thomas thought to double-check the students. Perhaps someone had gotten worse. It was announced that the exams would be retaken. Parents of school children immediately started to be indignant. They said that children always take something during exams, but retaking exams because they drank energy drinks was too much. Jerry's teacher tried to calm the outraged parents. Among them were only famous names. Varna noted that their response was much different than she had hoped for. Varna tried to explain the situation to them. She said that the children had not taken the usual energy drink. After taking it, they started experiencing side effects, and it was all very serious. But the parents didn't listen to her at all. They thought that Varna did not understand anything about it, and that they, the parents, knew better what they could and could not do with the children. Varna couldn't understand what was wrong with these people. Their children are sick because of school, and they are panicking about retaking an exam. Don't they realize that drugs are very dangerous? Varna wondered if they could demonstrate why drugs were so dangerous. However, help came from where it was not expected. The mayor himself came to the school. He asked for a notice for being late as the schedule was very tight. Varna was very surprised at his arrival. The mayor bowed and apologized to everyone present. He realized that his son had played a significant role in the whole incident. He also said that the drug the school children took was an unusual drug, and the police have already conducted their own investigation. It showed that children were put at risk by the drug, and are they, the parents, more concerned about retaking the exam? He thought the parents had gathered because of the appearance of side effects. Varna thought she had been afraid of him for nothing. The mayor turned out to be a very tough man. At last, this tedious meeting was over. She was genuinely grateful to the mayor for intervening because essentially no one was listening to her. As she stood there thinking about everything, the mayor came up and called out to her. She didn't expect it. He asked, "Is she the same Miss Vanessa who is replacing Miss Sophia?" Vanessa still couldn't believe that the mayor himself was addressing her. The mayor apologized for Dean being rude to her. Vanessa hurried to reassure him that it was okay. He also noted that he was impressed with Vanessa's demeanor at the meeting. She was confident despite the fact that representatives of well-known families were present. She smiled and said she was just a local nurse. The mayor said he'd heard she was the one who'd discovered the side effects, but Varna joked that it wasn't her fault either. The mayor extended his hand to her and asked her to take care of his son. He said that she was a wonderful teacher, and with her help they could build a bright future for Blairock. She thought to herself that she was already doing it, just using her own methods. While they were talking, Thomas ran up to them. Varna asked, "What is it?" Thomas looked at her with some reproach. He asked to speak to her when she was free. Varna said goodbye and left. The mayor looked at her in surprise. She looks so young and she is already a mum. When Varna approached Thomas, he asked, was this type really her type? Varna shouted that Tomas was thinking about the wrong thing. The mayor is an ordinary father who cares about his child. Turns out the mayor was a widower, but Varna didn't know that. And he was still considered a favored groom because of the family's power. Varna noted that Thomas is very much in the know. Thomas explained, the mayor had once been a candidate for his sister's husband, so he had to gather information about him. Varna wondered, so what did he want to talk to her about? He wanted to talk to her about Jerry's teacher. Varna wondered what was wrong with him. The principal was to blame and the teacher had nothing to do with it. Thomas revealed that he had spoken to the teacher. One day a teacher said that Thomas should become a detective, as he had all the aptitude for such activity. Thomas realized that the teacher had somehow guessed that he was not an ordinary schoolboy, but a detective. Moreover, the teacher obviously knew beforehand about the headmaster and the revitalizing potion. Thomas said that the teacher deliberately set up daily experiments late at night. He wanted to expose the principal. The teacher didn't understand why he thought that. Thomas said he saw Jerry's teacher watching the principal at night. It was as if he had been waiting for the moment she walked into the lab. Thomas said he saw with his own eyes. The teacher tried to joke that it wasn't like that. Thomas was sure that the first person to experience the power of the drug was Miss Sophia. After all, it was she who had first learnt about the revitalizing potion from the headmaster. When Miss Sophia fainted in front of Ben, he immediately told all. Then Thomas thought that perhaps Mr. Jerry had heard something from Miss Sophia. Jerry's teacher noted that Thomas had done a straightforwardly flawless job. He also noted that Thomas was absolutely right. The teacher was aware of the revitalizing potion, but he wasn't sure about its side effects. But the teacher was confused by one student who was fainting and not taking the drug. It was Thomas himself. But more and more children were getting sick. He could see that the principal was very worried about the situation, and he guessed it all. He wondered how he could come up with publicity for all of this, but in a way that wouldn't hurt Sophia. Thomas realized that this made sense. If the teacher knew about the existence of the drug from the beginning, the consequences, and continued to take it, she could not escape responsibility. Jerry's teacher asked him not to tell anyone that Miss Sophia had taken the medicine. She basically knew nothing. Thomas guessed that there was some connection between Jerry's teacher and Miss Sophia and asked about it. But Jerry slyly turned the topic of conversation and addressed the question to Thomas. What was his connection to Miss Vanessa? He asked Thomas who he was to her, son or husband. Jerry remembered the day in the infirmary. He'd seen a grown-up Thomas there. He realized that the man and the schoolboy were the same person. Thomas decided to pretend he didn't know what he was talking about. Jerry remembered the oddities he had noted that day. Suddenly, there was a father with a Thomas face. The way he was talking to Vanessa and the conversation did not resemble the kind of conversation that mothers and sons usually have. Also, Thomas often expresses himself like an adult. Jerry said that anyone in his shoes would have suspected something wrong. Thomas turned away for he had nothing to say. He relayed this conversation to Varna. She was surprised at what Jerry had said. What are they going to do now? Jerry's teacher came up to them and said that Miss Vanessa probably had a lot of secrets herself. Varna wondered how long Jerry's teacher had been here. He had come because he had heard that she and Thomas had come to the school because of the revitalizing potion. But Jerry's teacher was more interested in another question that he really wanted an answer to. He asked how the body had shrunk. Varna's whole look said that she didn't like this question very much. The teacher hurriedly assured me that everything was all right. All sorts of amazing things happen in this town. It was all on the curse of the Raven Witch. Varna thought he'd almost guessed it. The teacher said that none of this really mattered to him, but the fact that they had saved Sophia did matter. Varna wondered why they were called saviors. A beautiful girl ran into the room. Vanessa didn't recognize her. She said her name was Sophia. She was very well rested, and this result was reflected on her face. Jerry's teacher said that Sophia always has too much work to do. She has too much work to do. She is exhausted by the daily chores, so she hardly ever rests. But thanks to Vanessa, Miss Sophia was able to have a great rest. Sophia thanked Varna for looking after the owl class for her, and she wanted to know how she could thank her. Varna said that anyone in her place would have done the same thing. She had done nothing special. Sophia confessed to using the revitalizing potion. She had no idea it could cause such adverse reactions, but she hopes that the police will now take care of it. Thomas turned to the head of the class, Tina, and said they needed to talk. Tina asked what question he wanted to ask. He wanted to find out about Mr. Jerry's big secret that Tina herself had once mentioned. Perhaps it concerned Miss Sophia. Tina shouted out how he had managed to find out. It turns out that Mr. Jerry's teacher was married to Miss Sophia. Thomas was genuinely surprised by this information. They kept it a secret that they were a couple. Their wedding took place in secret, as the family of Jerry's teacher was strongly opposed to the union. That's why from day one he'd been able to understand that Thomas and Vanessa were not mother and son, but spouses. Those words made Varna simply turn purple. Sophia also tried to find out from Thomas whether they were a couple or not. When he said no, she couldn't understand what they were to each other. When they argued, they looked so much like a normal married couple. Sophia and Jerry laughed. They said that's usually how it started. But Vanessa and Thomas were adamant that none of this had anything to do with them. Tina kept asking Thomas about the role of the prince, but if he hated her so much, she could give him a better deal. She suggested he play the part of the prince, and for that she would summon a Raven Witch at the festival. Thomas watched with genuine amazement, for he knew who the real Raven Witch was. Tina was sure he really liked the Raven Witch. She said that all her friends just loved her. Thomas admitted that he liked her too. Tina noticed Thomas's smile. She noted that it suited him, and he shouldn't be gloomy all the time. Then she wondered if Thomas would play the part of the prince, and to her surprise, he said yes. Thomas came to Varna's pharmacy shop, and inquired about the occurrence of adverse reactions in school children. She said they were feeling better. She thinks most of the common revitalizing potion was confiscated. Varna finally managed to prepare an antidote, which she happily announced. Thomas wondered, was it really for him? Varna replied that it was. She managed to accidentally find out at school how she could get it over with quicker and get him back to his old adult self. It's about time. And it was indeed true. Varna managed to make the remedy faster than Thomas had anticipated. Varna was pleased to declare that she was a true genius. However, there was no sign of joy on Thomas's face, and Varna noted it. Was he not pleased? Thomas's question was a surprise to her. He asked if he took the antidote, would he be able to go back to being Thomas? Varna had said that the potion that had shrunk him was only one of a kind. Did he really enjoy being a little boy so much? But it was something else entirely. He reminded himself that the festival was coming up. Varna couldn't believe her own ears. Was it really about the role of the prince? But it's true because he made a promise. Varna noted that he was already able to find out Mr. Jerry's secret. He was able to find out much more than what Tina could tell him. Thomas remembered that they rehearsed every day, and the script had been written with great difficulty. Varna pointed out that he was just being tormented by his conscience, and rightly so. Thomas said she could think whatever she wanted to think, but he just felt sorry for Tin when he decided to play the part. She was in great despair, and even lured him with what Tina had promised, to summon a raven witch at the festival. Varna wondered, how could she summon her? Thomas replied that there was only one way she could do it. Call someone who could pretend to be a raven witch. There was no other way. Thomas made the decision that he would drink the antidote after the festival was over. There was a giggle and Aaron appeared in person. Turns out he heard the whole thing. Is Cyan going to play the role of the prince at the festival? Cyan nodded, which meant the answer was yes. The next day the festival started. Varna congratulated everyone on this festival. However, it was as if the school children didn't hear her. They were still sitting bent over their textbooks, as if the day had been quite ordinary. Varna announced that there would be no classes due to the festival. They didn't want to sit and cram on such a day, did they? But even after that, there was no joyful response. Varna found it hard to believe that there are kids who don't want to play. But if you think about it, parents who have traveled to school in the past have risked their children's lives for grades. Varna thought, maybe they were just afraid because they might get in big trouble if their parents found out about the entertainment. The school children nodded their heads. Varna was right. Varna said that she was only temporarily fulfilling the role of teacher. She will probably not be here at the end of the festival, so whatever they do, there is nothing to be afraid of. So she offered to blame it on her. They could safely say that the teacher kicked them out and threatened to give them bad marks if they didn't come out. But this suggestion was not received with joy either. Only one girl asked, "Is it really possible?" Varna smiled and said, "Of course, yes." Apparently the children now finally believed her. They were smiling, laughing. The classroom emptied out. Varna was surprised at the speed with which the students ran out of it. Yeah, the kids were just afraid of their own parents. However, there was still one student left in the class, Ben. He thought he didn't deserve to be entertained. Varna hurried to comfort him. Dean had taken the first place in the exam undeservedly, but there would be a retake soon, and Ben would definitely take his first place again. Varna remembered that she hadn't seen Dean since that day. Ben said Dean would be gone for a while, but for what reason he didn't know. Maybe Dean was just too ashamed of what had happened, and Varna had plans to talk to Dean. Ben didn't want to go anywhere. Varna decided to help him, grabbing his arm and dragging him along. There was a special atmosphere in the school during the festival. Trade pavilions were on display. There were a lot of visitors. Ben noted that there were many more guests than participants. Varna noticed a student holding a pigeon class sign. An arrow showed where the performance could be viewed. The stage for the play was huge. There were also a lot of spectators. Everyone was waiting for the performance to start. Someone called out to Vanessa. She turned round and saw a man in a duck suit. He asked her why she was so late. Vanessa stared at that duck. She wanted to know who was hiding in that image. Suddenly, the snake on the suit came undone and Varna saw Aaron. Next to him was Dee Dee. She wondered where he had managed to get that nice duck suit. Tina said it was a suit she'd lent him. When Tina saw Ben, she couldn't help but ask why he was here. Maybe he was brought here by force. Varna replied that it was her initiative. Tina thought Ben might be able to help them, but he flatly refused. Varna spotted a suit in the corner of the room. It was a witch's outfit. There was a hat, a wig, and other accessories necessary for the image. Varna noted to herself that it was almost identical, but she said aloud that she'd heard from Thomas that a raven witch had been invited to the festival. Tina admitted that she would really like to see a real-life raven witch at the festival, but she doesn't have that opportunity. She doesn't know how to contact her, but she asked for help from Miss Sophia, who will play the role of the raven witch. Tina asked her not to tell Thomas anything so that it would be a surprise for him. Tina started to kick all the outsiders out of the room as the show was about to start, but she asked Ben to stay. The performance began. Tina came on stage and announced it. The heroine of the play, a witch, appeared on the stage. She was wearing a mask. Tina announced the start of the first mission, the kidnapping of the princess. From the looks of it, the play promised to be quite extraordinary. In the scenario, the witch arrived at the fortress where the princess lived. But a princess appeared. She seemed very sturdy and was much taller than the witch herself. The witch was frightened and decided that the kidnapping could be carried out later. And finally, the main character of the whole play, the prince. Thomas came out. He looked very handsome. Varna noted that a lot of thought had gone into his costume. The duck, under whose mask Aaron was hiding, shouted, "Then the prince is just cute." Thomas immediately recognized that Aaron was. He was the only one who could behave like that. The announcer continued, "The witch decided to kidnap the prince of a neighboring country because he seemed weaker." Varna noted that the audience was really large, as it was for a village fete. Varna saw a man among the spectators. She easily recognized him as George Grosvein, whom she had turned into a goat at her wedding. What was he doing here? Varna had a curious idea in her head. She turned to Mr. Aaron as she needed his help. Meanwhile, the show went on, and the witch had to kidnap the prince. But a raven witch rushed to her aid. But it was a real witch. Tina heard the voice and realized it belonged to Miss Vanessa. Viewers started shouting that it wasn't a real raven witch, but a regular fake. Thomas started to ask what she was doing. Maybe she should stop before it's too late, but Varna was sure that the situation was under complete control. Varna asked Tina for a mouthpiece. She turned to Mr. George Grosvein in public. He was mildly surprised, for he was addressed by name. Thomas was unaware that George Grosvein was present and was surprised to see him. Varna threatened to put the raven curse on George again. George was frightened. He realized that there was a real raven witch on the stage. He was so frightened that he ran out of the hall screaming. However, his path was blocked by Aaron in the guise of a duckling. Something incomprehensible began to happen on the stage. The audience asked each other, "What is going on? Could it be the director's idea?" The commotion ended, and the spectator saw a large duck holding a ferret. The duckling said that the transformation was complete, and the spectator became a ferret. People began to whisper. They realized they were looking at a real raven witch. Tina was stunned at everything that was happening. Varna apologized to her. After all, Tina had spent a lot of effort preparing, and Varna had messed up her plans. But Tina was just thrilled with everything that was going on. She thought it was a great improvisation. Tina led Varna to the stage and said that this was a special guest, and the fact that the Raven Witch was here with them tonight would remain within the walls of this hall. But the performance would go on. Thomas suddenly exclaimed. He realized that the situation was out of control. Varna looked at him questioningly and wondered what was going on. Thomas said that apparently the side effects had returned again, as the arm was starting to enlarge. What a bad time this was. Varna and Thomas wondered what to do. They could not tell Tina everything. But Thomas said it's okay, he knows a way. And the plan was that Varna decided to kidnap the prince instead of the timid witch. He lifted him easily into her arms. But something like that wasn't in the script. Tina didn't like that idea. She screamed at me. Varna said Thomas was a little sick and asked for 10 minutes. Since the action was already going off script, Tina decided to take the initiative. She shouted into a loudspeaker that the prince had been kidnapped by a raven witch. But what was a shy witch to do? The witch had no answer to that question. Tina was confused about what to do. The right solution was whispered by someone's voice. The final song could be moved forward, which would not create problems in the whole context. Tina wanted to thank her savior and turned round, but found no one. Now she was very interested in who had said it. Ben was the savior. He was there the whole time. Tina asked him to help them out, but Ben didn't agree because he had things to do. It was already the middle of the game, but Thomas still hadn't returned. Tina was very nervous. Varna kept worrying about whether they had done the right thing. Thomas assured her that everything would be all right. Finally, Thomas is back. When Tina saw that instead of a little boy there was a handsome grown man, she was shocked. Tina thought for a moment that she'd just made a mistake. Thomas couldn't have grown up like that in just a few minutes. The onlookers also began to whisper. They couldn't understand what was going on. Just now this man was playing a childish role. Thomas confessed that he had been under a special spell of a non-growing body. The play continued. Thomas said that even though he was a prince, he did not want to be a king in the future. He was resigned to his present fate. Tina watched the play continue and couldn't understand. This adult had uttered the original line. How could it be? Thomas continued. He saw that the witch did not really dare to commit an atrocity, and he realized that in this life, you don't have to do what you don't really want to do. And the moment the witch realizes this, the curse will disappear. Then he bowed his knee to the witch and said it was all thanks to her. Tina apparently came to her senses and said that everything was true, because the witch was originally a child with a good heart, but her mother just forced her to become a witch. The former prince's replica gave the witch courage. She pulled off the ugly mask and took off her wig. She turned into the person she always wanted to be, a ballerina. Varna is somewhat tired of everything going on. She decided to find out from Aaron when he was able to prepare for the side effects. Turns out that's where Aaron helped. He advised him to think of an additional scenario in case something went wrong. Thomas stood there wondering what really happened there. The Raven Witch had pretended to be herself, and why George Grosvein was at the performance. The play was concluded to a standing ovation. Tina shouted happily that everything was awesome. Miss Vanessa really did look like a real Raven Witch. Varna smiled and thanked him for his kind words, and added that it was just the way it was. Tina also thanked Thomas's dad. He was able to come up with such a great scenario in case Thomas suddenly got sick, and he's very handsome. Sion said that Thomas had initiated it. Tina was touched that Thomas was so concerned about the success of the play and thought of the performance. Miss Sophia also expressed her admiration. It turns out that she was very afraid of the stage. She wondered how long it took to prepare. Varna said everything was impromptu and she was also very scared. Thomas's recovery was completed safely. He and Varna traveled to the warehouse where George Grosvein was stationed. Sion was in a great hurry. Varna could hardly keep up with him, but in fact there was no hurry, for George was thoroughly bound. Varna decided to tease Sion. He was so serious about being a prince that she was pleasantly surprised. After all, he could have just pretended to be sick and left the show, but he didn't. Sion said that he had seen the students from the pigeon class making serious preparations. They were thinking about the script, the scenery, the costumes. He couldn't take it all and ruin it, for that wouldn't be right to them. They noticed the fireworks. It was a very beautiful sight. Varna stopped to admire it. There was a feeling that they were at a real festival. It was really very beautiful. Varna thought it's a pity that Aaron can't see all this. Sion looked at her with a somewhat strange look. Sion grabbed Varna's hand and said that there was no time to rest now. We must go on. Varna was very interested in the answer to one question, and she asked it. She asked if they had met before. Sion threw a surprised look at her. Varna held his hand tightly, and he asked her first to let him go. Sion said if they'd met before, they'd recognize each other immediately. Maybe she confused him with someone else. Varna noted that she had heard that statement before. Perhaps she had indeed confused him with someone else. They hurried on. Sion walked on, thinking that Varna couldn't recognize him. In fact, she shouldn't recognize him. When they got to the right place, Aaron was there. They apologized to him for having to wait quite a long time for them. Aaron noticed happily that Sion was himself again. Aaron remembered the script he had prepared and asked if it had come in handy. Sion replied that yes, it had to be used. So Aaron missed out on all the fun and didn't get to watch the real Sion play on stage. It was a shame. George was inside the warehouse. Varna wondered if she should go with him, but Sion said he could manage on his own. When the warehouse door opened, George Grosvein feared that the Raven Witch herself had arrived, but it was only Sion. George was indeed tightly bound and on his knees. George asked who he was. Sion replied that he did not know him, but then how did he know his name? Sion replied that it was his prerogative to ask questions in this situation, and if George answered them honestly, he would be out of here soon. George had nothing left to do but agree to that. He had no other choice. Varna and Aaron were watching what was happening. She was worried that Sion was behaving unacceptably as a policeman, while Aaron, on the contrary, pointed out that he was behaving like a gang leader and was very cool. Sion first asked George if it was the first time he had sold drugs at school. He said that yes, it was the first time. George admitted that he needed to sell as many drugs as possible to get the bonuses. That's why he came to the festival. Is George willing to do anything to get as much money as possible? After all, the Raven Witch had already taught him a good lesson, but he had learnt nothing from it. George told me that he'd stopped being given pocket money. Then a man proposed to him. Sion asked. George was not aware of the fact that it was all for money, George confirmed. Sion shouted that George was not living his first day in the world, and what he said was no excuse. Did he not realize that he was going to a school where children learn? George cried. He didn't understand why all the accusations were being heaped on him. He thought he had nothing to do with it. Thomas looked at him in surprise. Could this really be popular? George continued to sob. He was told that there are people who need it all and have been actively using it for a long time. Drugs are not only spread at school. Sion went out and recounted the whole conversation to his comrades. They did not believe what George had said. Aaron scratched the back of his head. He hadn't realized it was so common. Varna reflected on what she had heard. She surmised that the school was the first place to be tested. Friends agreed with this. After all, it is really at school that you can get results from using the drug. The school children did take a lot of substance, and the parents didn't even oppose it. They thought that their children were using common stimulants. Aaron said, if Varna is right, then whoever planned all this is a real scumbag. After all, the children were acting as guinea pigs. Aaron recalled Sion's words that a police investigation had been launched, but Sion didn't trust him. Varna and Aaron stared at him. They could not believe that the policeman had said those words. Sion asked, why did he turn to them for help? He felt that the police were powerless in this case. It cannot block the flow completely. Varna thought he was right. If one recalled the constantly brooding appearance, he had guessed something from the beginning. But until now, he had kept silent for some unknown reason. Sion thanked everyone for a job well done. Varna didn't understand at first what this was all about, but he explained that up to this point they had acted as agreed, the investigation at the school. But now he and the police would be in charge of the case. Aaron took his words as a distrust of them. Varna understood why this was happening. The preparation of the antidote was complete. The antidote had been obtained, so there was no need to cooperate with them. Aaron was extremely sorry to say goodbye to Miss Varna, and she was even happy about it, because she no longer had to fulfill the role of a mother, which was already boring. Varna invited Sion to come to the shop to get the antidote that was waiting for him. Aaron listened and didn't understand why Varna and Sion were so calm. Aaron was saddened by everything that was happening. Varna, on the other hand, thought, whatever happens, it's all for the best. For her, a connection with the cops was unwelcome. Sion had to go back into Thomas's character again and announce that he was transferring to another school. Tina was upset. She tried to find out where he would go to school next, but Thomas could not say anything about it. Tina sobbed. She didn't understand how anyone could transfer to another school when he had just shown up at theirs. And he had so many good roles ahead of him. Thomas said he would miss it all. The news of Thomas and Varna's departure spread throughout the school. Ben heard about it and asked Varna. She confirmed that it was, and now Ben would be able to get some rest. He said that he was so busy with his studies that he didn't have time for anything. However, there were rumors that Ben would be taking part in the next show. Tina had already told everyone about it. It turns out that back during the festival, Ben had taken a keen interest in everything that was going on. He was secretly helping her, but pretended he wasn't. Varna was glad of that. She thought there was something else to do besides studying. Ben justified that Tina was short of laborers, so he helped her out of pity. Varna thanked Mr. Jerry and Miss Sophia for everything, and especially for not asking too many questions. They said they would be glad to see her at school under her real name. Varna and Thomas were seen off with tears in their eyes. They left. Varna thought she should see Dean again. She walked and remembered the conversation with him. Then she showed Dean the substance he'd added to the regular medicine. He then asked her if she was really stronger than his father, but he didn't want to accept that someone could be stronger than his dad. Varna thought that despite his brash nature, Dean was sweet in his own way. Thomas concluded that she just liked rude people, but that wasn't the case. Well, the school investigation at Triplet High has come to an end. Sion Crawford's body is back to the way it was. When Varna gave him the antidote, the first thing he wondered was if she was reliable. There was no telling what she might have slipped him. Sion worried that taking the antidote might also cause side effects, but Varna denied it. She also gave him an ointment to be applied to the affected areas. Varna also remembered that Cyan had once wanted to dispose of her potions that were located in the basement. She wondered if that wish was still there. Cyan simply offered to forget about that conversation, which couldn't help but please Varna, as she was very worried about her medication. He advised her to be more careful from now on, or better yet, to beef up her security to avoid getting into such an unpleasant situation again. When Cyan left Didi, the ferret just cried. Cyan had given him the goodies. Varna didn't understand why Didi was so upset, but Cyan was a clever boy, and he understood the reason for his sadness at once. He reached into his pocket and handed over everything he had. Didi seemed to have received the cherished goodies, but instead of joy, he was even more upset. Aaron entered the apothecary shop. It upset him to have to part with Miss Varna. Apparently, he had forgotten that they lived in the same town. He asked that she make a promise to meet her for lunch at least once in a while. Varna smiled. That was a good idea. Aaron demanded that Cyan say something last to Miss Varna. Cyan wished her that she would never get into trouble again. After all, if she ran into the police again, there could be trouble. Varna smiled and said she would be very careful. Aaron thought that the farewell should have been different, so he shouted at Cyan and called him an ill-mannered fool who couldn't say anything useful. Aaron and Cyan waved to Varna and left. Varna had to go back to her routine because the 2 crazy weeks had flown by. She was still serving customers behind the counter of her apothecary shop. Varna liked the silence that reigned in the apothecary's shop. No more children and their ambitious parents. But Varna's own behavior changed somewhat. She became frightened of children dressed in triplet school uniform. The school and her shop seemed far away from each other, but some students traveled even here. She also couldn't get the officer out of her mind. She still thought she had seen him somewhere. She's got a lot of things to do. Though she was a little hurt that she had contributed a lot to the investigation, and she had been thrown out so easily. But nothing she'll see how the police can handle the case. Cyan came home. He wanted to talk to his older brother. The brother was Victor Crawford. He was the new owner of the family hotel business. Cyan asked him. A month ago, the 3rd son of the Grosswind family had come to their hotel, but Victor couldn't remember everyone who came to the hotel. Cyan replied that Victor was not a guest right now. Victor wondered if Cyan wanted to talk about something else or if he was just checking up on him. Cyan warned, ready to stop him. Victor came close to his brother and wondered how he would do it. He was not afraid of him at all because he thought Stone was just a helpless kitten. Cyan was completely calm. He said he'd had to see a lot lately. Victor thought he was just joking and nothing more. Cyan decided not to waste time talking, said goodbye and left. Victor didn't think he would get rid of him so quickly. Victor stared after him, unable to understand where the guy got such confidence from. Cyan went back to his room and told Aaron about the conversation. He shouted at him. Aaron didn't understand why Cyan had done that. Cyan had actually gone to his brother's house to talk to him. He had hoped to have this conversation. From this, Aaron concluded that Cyan had learned that George was there on a fishing expedition. Cyan said he only saw on George Grossvein that day. That's where he spotted Harold Wolf. Aaron shouted that there was no such thing. After all, Harold Wolf was the chief of police. That day, Cyan did not attach much importance to his appearance, for the hotel is frequented by different families. But after a while, Cyan thought something was amiss. Maybe there was some hidden connection between his family and the police chief. But why had he kept silent all the time and only now he remembered? Cyan had a plan in his head. He wanted Aaron to help realize it. Aaron suggested that maybe it would be better to tell Sheriff Ryan about everything. Cyan got ready to leave, but Aaron stopped him. If Cyan rejoins the police force, he'll be able to meet Miss Varna, won't he? Cyan was surprised by this question. Aaron worried that Cyan, back on duty along with the sheriff, would become diligent in catching the Raven Witch. Cyan assured that this would not be the case as he is only working on the documentation. From this judgment, Aaron concluded that Cyan spent most of his time shifting papers. Is that the job of a policeman? Cyan shouted that policemen did not have to do nothing but run around the streets. It was evident that this judgment did not please him. Cyan went to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Ryan apologized for not being able to visit Cyan at the hospital. Aaron wouldn't let her in. Cyan assured the sheriff that he felt fine. It was strange that while Cyan was sick, nothing was heard about the witch horn. There was even a joke in the police department that they shared the same disease. Cyan asked about the revitalizing potion case. Since it was a drug case, the case was handed over to the task force. I wonder why Zion is showing such curiosity about this case. Zion replied that he had heard a lot about him, which was why he was curious. He recalled how he had recently said that he and the police would handle the case. Though he has made such a promise, he has no other option, only to observe the situation from within. However, the sheriff has some interesting news. It turns out that Zion has been transferred out of the clerk's office because one of the employees hurt his leg. So Zion will have to run around a bit from now on. Zion didn't understand what it meant to run around a bit and ask the sheriff again. Turns out there's been a hunt for the Raven Witch. Since all the work was done and Varna had a lot of free time, she decided to shake her old ways and became a Raven Witch again. Varna was once again cleansing the city of the criminal elements of society. When, as she thought, the enemy had been punished, another one she hadn't seen approached her from behind. It took her a bit of fiddling before she disarmed him. The right medicine was always at hand. She gave him a shot in the back of his neck. The robbers had been disarmed and were sleeping peacefully. Varna had a pretty rough day. Varna stretched happily, looking out over the city, which was clearly visible from the rooftop. When she went upstairs, she thought she'd be happy up here. Only today it wasn't like that. She thought back to the previous days, in which there had been many different events. She remembered Thomas, and it had been really cool, but it had passed. So she had to pick herself up and get to work as a Raven Witch. Varna heard the stomping of feet. She looked down and noticed the police. I wonder what they're doing here. One of the policemen was Zion. He was clearly tired from the physical exertion. He hadn't had to run so much in a long time. It turns out that Zion had very little physical fitness. That's why he had to do most of the paperwork. The only thing he'd ever done before was patrol the city in the afternoon. And his main job was to make sure he didn't miss a kitty cat feeding. It's a real shame. Varna had good hearing, so she heard the whole conversation. The colleagues were discussing Zion and how he had managed to pass the physical fitness exam when he had to do pull-ups. They thought that such a cop was useless. Varna was already making devious plans on how she would tease Zion. She remembered the last conversation she'd had with him. He'd said if she ran into the cops, there'd be trouble. Maybe it made sense to talk to him. But immediately she discarded the idea. No, she'll still talk to him, though. Besides, he's behind the other cops. As Zion was catching his breath, Varna appeared in front of him in person. She smiled at him as she hadn't seen him in a while. Sion looked at her and wondered what she was doing here, why she wasn't running away when she was being hunted. She remembered that it wasn't his plan to catch the Raven Witch, but somehow he was here. Alas, he had no control over the situation. She looked at him with a sly look and asked, had she given up beforehand because he lacked physical fitness? Didn't she? He realized that she had heard everything, and that made him furious. Varna couldn't resist making a little fun of him and his poor physical condition. She could have given him some medication without side effects. However, he was trying to deal with it on his own by exercising. Not missing the opportunity, she asked how the investigation into the revitalizing potion was going. Sion said that everything was fine. Varna said she could help a little if needed and share some information about the medicine. Zion rejected the help. To Varna, it was akin to an insult. Why would he refuse her help? Maybe he didn't think she was capable enough. But that wasn't the point. Sion just didn't want to cooperate with her as he didn't like it. How dare he say that? He basically said she was unpleasant, and she just wanted to be helpful and offered to help. Fine, she doesn't want to suit herself. But if he tries to ask her for help later, he shouldn't do it. The colleagues called out to Sion. How long could they wait for him? He said goodbye to Varna and hurried towards them. Varna was upset by this attitude. She didn't see or hear anything around her as a man with a stick approached her from behind. He was clearly unfriendly. Luckily, Sion hadn't left yet, and he shouted frantically. He ordered her to get down, and delivered a powerful blow to the bandit. That one flew off. Varna hadn't expected that Sion's puny body contained such strength. She looked at him in surprise. For Varna, the attack came as a surprise. It seemed to be one of the bandits she had recently dealt with. Sion pulled himself up and inquired how she was. She was fine. Turns out he can fight and quite well. Sion replied that he was, after all, a police officer and had to know how to fight. Yes, he lacked physical fitness, but he would deal with that. For now, she should leave before her colleagues showed up. Varna didn't even argue with that and thanked him. She ran and thought, it was strange to get help from a cop while being chased. Is this really what normal life is like? And no matter what, she was in a good mood. Next, events moved to the mayor's residence. The materials he demanded were brought to him. The mayor began to study them carefully. Then he called Luca and instructed him to call the triplet school. Luca wondered why. The house where Zion and Aaron lived. Aaron burst into Sion's room and shouted that they were in big trouble. Sion took his eyes off the book and wondered what had happened. Aaron said the mayor had a desire to meet with Ms. Vanessa and have a chat with her. Sion wondered why. Aaron told me that he got a call from Jerry's teacher. He had received a call from the mayor at the school. Mr. Jerry was confused and immediately contacted Aaron. The mayor said he had the information he needed to investigate the case of the revitalizing potion. Sion didn't understand why the mayor needed all this, but immediately the answer came by itself. The mayor's son had become involved in the events surrounding the revitalizing potion. Aaron wondered how and with what they would go to Miss Varna. After all, Sion had told her to stay out of it the last time they met. Besides, Varna was just playing the role of Vanessa, and now it's over. So what are they supposed to do? Just show up at her place like nothing happened? Sion hesitated for a moment. The next day, they went to the apothecary's shop. Behind the counter stood the proprietress herself. She didn't expect Mr. Aaron to be her next visitor. Varna asked what he needed, perhaps some medicine. Behind Aaron's back stood Sion. She didn't notice him right away. When she saw that Aaron had come not alone but with an officer, she recalled that Sion didn't want to see her again. She wondered, so what had brought them to her? It didn't seem like any of them were sick. They told her about the mayor's call. The information she received discouraged her. She did not understand what the mayor wanted from her. Aaron said that the mayor wanted to ask her something about the revitalizing potion. He was looking for her anyway, so that's why they'd come to tell her about it. Varna remembered that the revitalizing potion was the reason they had met. Aaron didn't think she was obliged to see him. After all, the official story was that Miss Vanessa had left town. Varna wondered, what if he tried to find out what city she'd gone to, or did a personal search? What would happen then? So it was better to meet him once after all. She offered to go to the meeting and hear what the mayor had to say. She was sure they were also interested in what the mayor had to say about the revitalizing potion. And at the end, she decided to tease Sion by saying that the mayor had gone to a really experienced person like her. And he certainly wouldn't tell her to take her hands off this case like Sion did. Sion said that if they planned to go to the meeting with the mayor, he would go with them. Varna wondered, why? Sion said that since it was about the revitalizing potion, he was obliged to go. Besides, everything happened at his request. Varna said he was no longer her son, and it would be extremely strange if they came together. Aaron assured me not to worry about that, but he didn't say why. They went to the mayor's residence. He was already waiting for them and thanked them that Miss Vanessa had come after all. Varna was very beautiful. She said hello to Mr. Abrams and told him that she had not seen him for a long time. The mayor noticed that Varna had not arrived alone. He wondered who it was with her. She introduced her companion as James Benting's consort, but it was Zion. Sion said he did not want to send his spouse alone on such a long journey, because she's so fond of attracting trouble. Introducing Zion as a husband was Aaron's idea. Varna didn't like her very much, but Sion agreed that it was a viable option. Besides, the students of the school know him as Thomas's father, and the mayor himself is a parent. Varna was worried that someone might recognize Sion in his real guise, but Aaron assured me that wouldn't happen. Only a handful of policemen know Sion by sight, but Varna didn't like it anyway. She thought that role-playing was a thing of the past, and that she would have to play the role of a wife instead of a mother again. Sion and Varna were always arguing about something. They were like real spouses, too. The mayor noted that they have a very sweet relationship. The mayor invited them to follow to a hall with comfortable couches. When everyone was comfortably seated, the mayor said, the person distributing the revitalizing potion belonged to one of the city's famous families. He was sure of it. Sion and Varna looked at him questioningly. Was the mayor really sure that this was the case? Yes. His opinion was based on the fact that a drug that is not sold in any shop has quickly become popular, and those who have bought it believe in its efficacy. Therefore, he is sure that a certain authority is behind the distribution of the drug. He has guesses who is behind it, but he cannot name specific names. It turns out that even the mayor's powers are not so enormous. A huge part of the decision-making rights regarding Blairock are with the families. The mayor himself only became popular because he was able to unseat those in power who hoped for kinship ties. At least that's what people think. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Cyan believed the mayor was telling the truth. His power alone would not be enough to uproot the long-established power in the city. Yes, and Cyan himself had been sick of watching it all since he was a kid. That's why the mayor turned to Vanessa for help. Is the mayor himself coming to her for help? Today, the side effects of taking the drug go unnoticed. Some even believe that if the potion is so effective, one can turn a blind eye to many things. Varna stood and thought that the effectiveness was gained by combining the stimulant with the enhancers. But if it keeps spreading like this, and the sheriff didn't finish the thought, Varna did it for him. She said it would be almost impossible to stop it later, and the sheriff was of the same opinion. So Vanessa will have to pay attention to the side effects, just like she did earlier in school. And that's the only way it can work. Varna was kind of okay with it, but public speaking had always been something she didn't like. However, that was just an excuse. In truth, she just didn't feel like shining her face in the light again. Cyan supported her. If it was the side effects of the medicine that needed to be pointed out, why not go to other specialists? It didn't have to be his Vanessa. The mayor said he's been thinking about it too, but he wouldn't want to involve any outsiders, as he doesn't know how involved the families are in all this. But then what if she targets Vanessa? Isn't she in danger in all this? Vanessa sat there and said nothing. Cyan continued, "What are the police doing then? Just sitting around." Varna didn't like that tone of voice because Cyan was also a policeman, and he could hurt himself with it. The mayor replied that he himself was embarrassed by it, but he would not want to involve the police, because if it became known that the mayor himself was investigating, the police would simply find themselves in an awkward position. Cyan thought about it too, so the police were unaware of her situation. Varna thought that she didn't have to disclose personal details, and in that case she could really help. In that case, there shouldn't be any problems. Varna looked at Cyan, but he said nothing. His silence seemed to agree with her words. When they left the mayor's office, he asked her why she had agreed to help the mayor. Besides, the mayor knew the same thing they knew. But Varna felt that this way they could learn even more. If they helped the mayor as much as they could get new information. Or maybe they'll be able to fully investigate the case with him at all. Only Cyan didn't want that. His plan was to do everything alone. She had no doubt he was planning to do it all on his own, although he had said earlier that he would work with the police. Varna grabbed his tie and pulled him to her. The whole thing was upsetting her a little. After all, Cyan had said earlier that he was against her involvement, and now he was approaching her about it. Varna thought he was just trying to exclude her from the case, and she spoke her mind directly. Cyan said that he wouldn't want to rule her out, but still the case of the revitalizing potion is only his. Varna didn't understand why this was just his case. She reminded herself that she'd had to torture George with the Raven Witch, and she'd also been the one to find out about the side effects. Cyan didn't deny it. Varna made the decision that she would work with the mayor, but Cyan still didn't like it all and said he wouldn't allow it. It would have been better if he had kept silent, as those words really pissed Varna off. He wasn't her mom, and even she had never done that to her. Varna said what she thought and cooled down a little. Cyan wondered if she was hungry, but it turns out she didn't eat breakfast today. Usually if she woke up late, she never ate, and he had told her more than once that skipping meals was unacceptable. They went off to find somewhere to eat. Varna walked and grumbled that once again during a serious conversation, it was about food. They came to the house of Cyan. He put his apron back on and began to work his magic in the kitchen. After a while, the pizza was ready. He served it to Varna. She had a great appetite. She ate the dish with pleasure. Everything Cyan cooked was always edible. Cyan asked Varna if she was really going to work with the mayor, but Varna never backed down from her decision, so she said yes, she would go there once a week. There was nothing left for him to do but agree with her decision. Only he was worried about her, and said that if there was even a hint of a threat to her safety, he would cross everything at the root. Varna thought they were just words, for Cyan was playing the part of her husband. Nevertheless, Varna thought the whole thing was ridiculous. She was not an ordinary woman, but a Raven Witch. The pizza he had prepared was a real treat. If she had her way, she would have eaten it in one sitting. Varna went to the mayor's residence. She was met by Luca, as the mayor was a very busy man. Varna said hello to Luca. Luca led her into the office, where there was a desk and an armchair. On the desk, there were documents spread out. Luca explained that the documents recorded everything they had learnt so far. She left Varna to sort out the paperwork and said she would be in the office opposite. Varna could go to her with all her questions. Varna realized that Luca was the mayor's secretary. Luca confirmed that she does. She also sometimes carries out various errands for the mayor. Varna noted that Luca looked very young and said so. It was true because Luca was only 17 years old. It was just amazing that a girl of that age was working in such a position. Varna returned to the apothecary shop and said the investigation was helpful. She was planning to publish an article in the paper, and to prevent anyone from making any denials, the story had to be backed up with evidence. Sion liked the idea. He thought that if it worked, the effect would be stunning. I wonder why he still comes to her shop. Sion again inquired if she had eaten. There he goes again. Yeah, she ate this time. Varna didn't understand why he asked her about food every time. Maybe the police officer's duties now included taking care of the health of the citizens? At the Crawford Hotel, Victor was chatting with his girlfriend. She was very angry. There was a plot to the south on which she planned to build buildings, but the mayor again did not give permission. He said there is a charity canteen for poor people there. Victor suggested that a building could be built next door in this situation. She didn't like that, because she didn't want to spend money on such things. Besides, she thought the mayor was a big hypocrite. He only pretends to be good because he needs to gain popularity. But that's all right, he'll soon be finished. All that's left is to finish the job. Victor tried to cheer her up and told her that she would do well. The girl asked about her marriage. Her mother was always bugging her because she wanted to get her daughter married as soon as possible. Oh, how nice it would have been if Victor had been her husband. But he already had a fiancée, and her family would be in for a real scare. She wondered if his younger brother had a fiancée. Victor said that he left home a long time ago and is definitely not her match as he is very pathetic. But the girl decided to meet with Sion to make sure of everything. She went up to his house, knocked. Sion himself opened the door. Her name was Olivia Cavendish. Olivia's family was very prominent. She headed Blarick's steel and railway industries. Olivia is the third daughter in this family. Olivia stood and smiled at Sion. He definitely knew her. Sion inquired about the purpose of her visit. Olivia didn't beat around the bush and immediately asked if he might be interested in a relationship with her. But Sion didn't want any relationship. Then she asked more specifically, would he marry her? Sion stood there wondering what the hell she was talking about. Does she really mean what she's asking? Could she be using some new kind of molestation? Olivia laughed. Why would asking her out be considered solicitation? It was kind of insulting. It's not like it's a big deal. Olivia laughed, wondering why asking her out would be considered harassment. Sion said that if that was her true purpose for the visit, she had come to the wrong place. And even if they were to marry, there would be no benefit to her from his surname, since he had completely abandoned the Crawfords. Olivia thought that Sion was acting like a teenager, that his behavior was nothing more than rebellion. I mean, he knows it's useless. Varna proceeded to review the materials. One man took a revitalizing potion for a week and never slept once in all that time. And as soon as he stopped taking the potion, he fell asleep and slept for 3 days. He had no other side effects. Weird, though. All the information she carefully wrote down. And this one on another man is worth bringing in, too. Luca thanked Vanessa for her hard work and then inquired about plans. Varna had nothing planned. Then Luca suggested that she go out to dinner with the mayor. Because of the mayor, Vanessa has to travel a long way every time. That's why he wanted to treat her to an udon for once. They seated themselves at a large table, and we started eating. The meat was delicious. The mayor has offered to have dinner with him every time she works. A guaranteed steak every week is a great bonus. But she remembered Sion and how he'd treated her. Surprisingly, she didn't feel uncomfortable with him. The mayor thought that his offer might be very burdensome to her. Varna smiled and said that yes, it was a little burdensome for her. The mayor laughed at this sincerity. He thought she was special. Varna left the mayor's residence and staggered down the street. It seemed to her that it was much more difficult at lunch than it had been while writing the report. If one was to eat, it was better to choose a comfortable environment. Varna was pleased with the result. I wonder if he would be surprised if he told the officer about it. When she reached the apothecary's shop, she noticed that Sion was waiting for her. He stood leaning against the wall. I wondered what he was doing here. Had he just been curious enough to come himself? Varna went up to him and asked him, what was he doing near her shop? But instead of making a reply, he just ducked his nose into her shoulder. Turns out he was just sleeping. A little time passed and Sion woke up. He didn't immediately realize where he was or what had happened. Varna immediately asked if he was awake. Sayan lifted himself up on the bed, looked around and wondered where he was. Varna led him to her house. He had absolutely no memory of coming to her. Does he really think she kidnapped him? To be more specific, when she saw him outside her shop, he was standing staggered. It was hard for her to bring him here. Sayan himself remembered what had happened. He realized that he had made her uncomfortable and apologized for it. His cheeks turned red as he did so. Varna looked at him with surprise. She said he had nothing to apologize for. So what had happened to him? Why was he in such a state? Sayan said nothing much happened to him. Varna had no doubt he'd say something like that. Sayan inquired if anything new had been learnt from the mayor. Yeah, Varna said she found a man who keeps taking the drug intermittently, and she's going to see him next week. The next day, Varna arrived at the mayor's mansion with Sayan. Luca said she would accompany them by car today. How many things this girl could do. They got into the car and drove off. Varna thought Sayan was wasting his time, but he wanted to see everything with his own eyes. They arrived at the site and traveled some distance on foot. It was very windy near the water. The wind blew Varna's hat off her head and carried it away. The hat fell into the water. Varna was upset by this, as it was her only hat. Sayan could see how upset Varna was, so he reached into the water to retrieve his hat. The important thing is, when did he get naked? Sayan managed to catch the accessory. He waded ashore and gave Varna the hat. Varna thanked him for that act. She had not expected him to do such a thing. Luckily, it was okay as it was shallow, but it is still very dangerous to jump into the water because of the hat. Sayan thought that Varna didn't value the hat too much, though that wasn't the case at all. The accessory was indeed dear to her. But it's still very dangerous to throw yourself into the water like that. Doesn't he realize that? Sayan thought she couldn't say that, as those words applied more to Varna herself, not him. Varna asked him to explain what he meant. Sayan, on the other hand, simply turned away from her. It was obvious that he did not want to answer the question.